When we think of the Jedi Order, we tend to think about it as it was depicted in the prequels, a highly centralized organization that answered to the Republic Senate. But the Jedi Order had a long history, and for most of that history, the Order was actually structured very differently. For over 20,000 years, it was much more decentralized, spread far and wide across the Republic, and it was generally less dogmatic and rigid. All that changed for a reason, but that's another story entirely. Today, we're going to be looking at the structure of this earlier stage of the Jedi Order and discussing how the Jedi operated in the time before the destruction of Ossus. The Jedi Order was born out of the Force Wars of Tython, fought between the remnants of the ancient Jedi Order. The Order was founded by the followers of Ashla, the light side of the Force, and though it inherited many of the older Jedi Order's traditions, it corrected the Jedi's understanding of the Force and the light side in particular. The core precepts of Jedi ideology, which we've discussed in the past, remained unchanged across the Jedi Order's 25,000 years of history. However, everything from how that ideology was put into practice to how the Order structured itself did. Nonetheless, it was on Tython that the basic structure of the Jedi Order was first conceptualized. Before the Jedi abandoned Tython and set off into the wider galaxy, eventually settling on Ossus in the Outer Rim. There, the Order developed in seclusion for some time, welcoming new members who came to Ossus and training them in the Jedi way. Some Jedi Knights left Ossus and set out across the galaxy, bringing back influences from other Force traditions and philosophical tendencies which were assimilated into the Jedi Order's own teachings. The Jedi were devoted, above all, to protecting the innocent from the ravages of Bogan or the dark side, but in their early years, they did this mostly on the small scale. Individual Jedi Knights would go out into the galaxy, battling injustice wherever they found it and bringing peace wherever they could. They traveled from the depths of the Outer Rim back into the core worlds, to the Tyon cluster and the human core. Their efforts saved many lives, but ultimately, they were drops in the ocean, small acts in a galaxy filled with chaos. Not every injustice could be fixed by individual Jedi Knights. For there to be peace in the galaxy, broader systems needed to be implemented to promote it. It was for this reason that some Jedi Knights fought in the unification wars in the core worlds, leading one side to victory to ensure the formation of the Galactic Republic. Several decades later, when the Republic charted a hyperspace route between its core systems and Ossus, the Jedi Order, after much debate, made the choice to align itself with the Republic and promote its expansion across the galaxy. After carefully studying the Republic, the Jedi Masters had come to the conclusion that it could be a powerful force for good. It was democratic, based on free association and self-determination, and while it was far from perfect, it was a much better alternative to the other great powers at the time, enough that the Jedi saw fit to promote its cause in the galaxy. This alliance was formed in 25,000 BBY, and it lasted for millennia. The nature of this alliance changed over time, however. Originally, the Jedi Order was independent from the Republic, an ally instead of a servant. The Jedi Knights kept the Republic safe from the threats that lurked on its borders, and they kept the peace within the Republic as well, but they acted in a largely unofficial capacity. The Jedi Council advised the Republic Senate, attempting to guide its decisions to be in accord with the light side of the Force, but it also reserved the right to recuse itself from Republic affairs if it disagreed with the way things were going. The Council remained based on Ossus, far from the heart of Republic politics, and for close to 20,000 years, the Order retained its independence. As we dive into the structure of the Jedi Order, we need to start by talking about Ossus. Ossus was an unusual planet, to say the least. It was part of a binary star system orbiting the stars Adega Prime and Adega Besh, and unlike the other planets in the system, it actually orbited its stars in a figure-8 pattern, coming between the binaries twice every year. During these transits, it was daytime across the entire planet for weeks on end. Temperatures would skyrocket, and most of the planet's surface water would evaporate during these times, but the planet would remain habitable and things would return to normal quickly after the transit ended. Ossus was a lush world, warm but not overly so. 2/3 of its surface were covered by oceans, while its rugged continents were dominated by dense forests and grassy plains. Ossus teemed with life, both plants and animals, and it was incredibly strong in the light side of the Force. The whole planet belonged to the Jedi, who spread out across its surface, building numerous academies and settlements. Others from across the Republic later settled on Ossus as well. Spaceports and cities were built on the planet after the Order joined the Republic, populated both by the families of the Jedi on the planet and by the refugees from across the galaxy, many of whom came to Ossus looking for more peaceful lives. The capital city of Ossus was Canossa, located in the Eotro Mountains of the planet's southern hemisphere. This spaceport settlement was founded as a Jedi pilgrimage site, and it expanded into a beautiful city, its buildings plated with bronzium and its spires ornamented with crystals. Canossa was the heart of culture on Ossus, home to spaceports, academies, and monuments to the history of the Jedi. Many other cities were established across Ossus, as were smaller farmsteads and settlements, plus a great many Jedi facilities. Unlike in later millennia, the Jedi didn't have one main temple that they operated out of during their time on Ossus. Rather, Ossus was home to a ton of Jedi academies, enclaves, and outposts, many of them scattered in the remote regions of the planet, as well as pilgrimage sites and Force-attuned crystal caves, the latter of which the Jedi would visit in later millennia to find lightsaber crystals. The largest Jedi training facility was Jedi Praxium, a 5-tiered ziggurat in Canossa that contained training grounds, dormitories, armories, dojos, the High Council's secondary meeting chambers, diplomatic suites, and a grand library. The Praxium was the heart of the Jedi Order, where Jedi trained, learned, and meditated on the Force, but it wasn't where the Order was governed from. Rather, the Jedi High Council was based out of another ziggurat known as the Eye of Ashlanei, located at the center of Canossa. Originally a monument and pilgrimage site built on the site of a battle between the Jedi Order and the Legions of Leto during the First Great Schism, the Eye of Ashlanei was a Force nexus in its own right, hallowed by millennia of Jedi meditation at the site. This temple was primarily given over to meditation chambers, with the largest located on the roof, designed for group meditation by up to 100 Jedi pilgrims. But the most sacred part of the Eye of Ashlanei was the catacombs below it, where many Jedi lay entombed, the echoes of their spirits bathing the tunnels in the light side. It was in these catacombs that the Jedi High Council met to make decisions on behalf of the Order, believing that the strength of the light side within the catacombs and the spirits of the Jedi Order's honored dead would help them understand the will of the Force. The largest of the Jedi Order's facilities, however, was the Great Library of Ossus, built in 5000 BBY by Jedi Master Odan-Ur. This massive facility replaced the Jedi Praxium Library as the Jedi Order's largest archive, containing a vast assortment of texts and historical artifacts. The archives of the Great Jedi Library were quite possibly the most comprehensive collection of knowledge in the entire galaxy, rivaled only by the Celebritas Archive of Obra Sky. Not only were copies of virtually every text ever written kept in the Great Jedi Library, but the original editions of many texts were, as well, carefully preserved in climate-controlled rooms. The Great Jedi Library was also home to a vast collection of artifacts, both Jedi and Sith in origin. All told, this facility represented the sum total of all of the Jedi Order's knowledge, and its loss during the destruction of Ossus was one of the greatest blows the Jedi Order ever suffered. As that overview of Ossus probably conveyed, the Jedi Order of this time was fairly decentralized. Just as the Jedi were spread across Ossus, so too were they spread across the galaxy, operating out of hundreds of small enclaves and satellite academies. These operated more or less independently, run by their own councils of Jedi Masters, so that the early Jedi Order was less like one order and more like thousands of tiny orders that all answered to Ossus. Nonetheless, the Jedi Order did have a central hierarchy, and from the very beginning of the Order, that hierarchy was topped by the Jedi Councils. Now, 9 times out of 10, when someone's talking about the Jedi Council, they mean the Jedi High Council, the governing body of the Jedi Order. But there were actually 4 Jedi Councils that ran the Order, with the High Council just being the most prominent. All 4 councils existed throughout the entire history of the Jedi Order, having originated from conclaves the founding masters of the Order used to make decisions. In later eras, each council had its own tower in the Jedi High Temple on Coruscant. In older periods, the High Council met beneath the Eye of Ashlanei, and it's unknown where the others met. The 3 less well-known Jedi Councils were the Council of First Knowledge, the Council of Reconciliation, and the Council of Reassignment, each made up of 5 members. 2 members of the Councils of Reconciliation and Reassignment sat for life, while the other 3 sat for 5-year terms and were regularly rotated out. For the Council of First Knowledge, only the leading member, the caretaker of First Knowledge, had a lifetime appointment, while the other 4 served 5-year terms. Seats on the 4 Jedi Councils were non-exclusive. Often, members of the High Council would be members of one of the other councils as well, though each council made a point of regularly bringing in new members with differing viewpoints and experiences. The Council of First Knowledge essentially governed the control of, well, knowledge. It oversaw all of the galaxy's Jedi academies, ensuring consistency of training standards across the Order and establishing what parts of the Jedi teachings were considered the most essential. This council also oversaw the operation of and acquisition of new materials for all Jedi archives and libraries, and it decided which of these materials and texts would be restricted to Jedi of higher ranks. The Council of First Knowledge also oversaw the Jedi Order's efforts to hunt down and either destroy or contain the slightest trace of dark side teachings or artifacts, especially those of Sith origin. During the Order's time on Ossus, it's possible that the Council of First Knowledge operated out of either the Jedi Praxium or the Great Jedi Library, but that's speculation on our part. The Council of Reassignment dealt with Jedi washouts and oversaw what would later become the Jedi Service Corps, to which Jedi initiates who failed to become Padawans were assigned. In the Order's later years, the 4 service corps were the Agricultural Corps, the Exploration Corps, the Educational Corps, and the Medical Corps, each of which were governed by their own councils, which in turn answered to the Council of Reassignment. It's unknown when the service corps were formalized, but the concept of them was around for most of the Jedi Order's history. Even before formal organization existed, Jedi washouts were still dispatched to live farmers' lives on planets like Telos 4. Ordinary Knights and Masters were also assigned shifts within the Service Corps. The Council of Reassignment oversaw all of this, determining what form of service Jedi washouts should undertake, and it also dealt with Jedi who wanted to leave the Order entirely. The Council of Reconciliation had 2 different but very important responsibilities. It acted as the Jedi Order's diplomatic arm and passed judgment on Jedi accused of crimes or falling to the dark side. The latter responsibility was self-explanatory, while the former differed depending on the era. In later periods, the Council of Reconciliation was affiliated closely with the Republic Diplomatic Corps and helped to mediate disputes between the Republic and outside groups or between Republic member worlds. In earlier periods, it likely served a more general purpose, engaging in diplomacy on behalf of the Order itself and mediating conflicts independent of the Republic. Then there was the Jedi High Council, the ruling body of the Jedi Order. The High Council was composed of 12 members. 5 had lifetime seats, while 4 were long-term temporary members and 3 were short-term temporary members. The council was led by the Master of the Order, which was a separate position from Jedi Grand Master, the rank afforded to the head of the Jedi Order. Oftentimes, these titles were given to the same Jedi, but sometimes different Jedi held the 2 positions, as was the case during the prequel era when Yoda served as Grand Master and Mace Windu served as Master of the Order. The Jedi High Council made decisions on behalf of the entire Order, which it reached by meditating as a group until the 12 Masters discerned the will of the Force on the topic. Only in times of extreme crisis did the High Council abandon this practice in favor of more traditional discussion and debate, which was faster, if more prone to misguided judgments. The High Council made most of the Jedi Order's important decisions, though occasionally, when faced with extremely complex issues, It would instead call a conclave of the entire Jedi Order, summoning all of the Order's best and brightest to Ossus, Deneba, or some other world to discuss and debate the issue in greater numbers. The Jedi High Council was also responsible for granting the rank of Jedi Knight to the Order's members, though the councils and masters of satellite academies sometimes also did this. Below the Jedi councils, the basic rank and structure of the Jedi Order was also fairly constant across its history, but there were a few key differences, so we're going to go through the ranks in full, starting at the bottom. In the final centuries of the Jedi Order, the lowest ranked Jedi was that of Initiate, assigned to young children that were not yet old enough to become Padawans. But for most of the Jedi Order's history, the Jedi Order was much more lax about recruiting older children and even adults, and so the Initiate rank, if it existed at all, was much more informal and held only for brief periods of time. Young children recruited by the Jedi were presumably treated as initiates before they were old enough for training, but the clan system and the program of initiate training instituted in later years didn't yet exist. For most Jedi recruits, the initiate stage was very brief, lasting only a few weeks or months during their initial training and the trials they would undertake while their masters determined their suitability to join the Order. Recruits that showed lots of promise right away sometimes skipped this stage altogether and were taken as apprentices by Jedi Masters right off the bat. Sometimes, Jedi Masters would take recruits as their apprentices but withhold the full title of Padawan until after they had proven themselves. The rank of Padawan was earned by passing the initiate trials, which in the old days involved 3 tests. The specifics of these tests varied greatly from Jedi Master to Jedi Master, but they always had the same purposes. The first tested the knowledge of the Jedi Code, the second consisted of crafting a lightsaber or forging a Force-imbued sword, and the third was a mission that the apprentice would have to complete alone. Initiates who passed the trials would be granted the rank of Padawan and formally apprenticed to a Jedi Knight or Master. Jedi of this period, especially Jedi Masters on far-flung worlds, often took multiple Padawans at a time, training them as a group in the hopes that they would learn from each other as well as from their master. Padawans typically assisted their masters as deputy Jedi watchmen or accompanied them on missions from the council, while at other times, masters would dispatch their Padawans on missions of their own, allowing them to confront challenges and learn by experience themselves. Padawans were generally afforded much more independence in this era. They were only restricted from taking apprentices of their own, and they were often free to travel the galaxy and carry out missions on their own. The Council even sometimes sent individual Padawans on important missions without their masters. Some Padawans even put their Jedi training on pause for months or years at a time, left their masters to go do other things, and returned to resume their training at a later time. Despite this much more lax training system, the end goal of Jedi apprenticeship was the same. Padawans were to be trained in all of the essential Jedi arts, and when their training was complete, they would face the Jedi trials. In later generations, the trials were standardized. There were 5 in total: the trials of skill, courage, spirit, flesh, and insight. But for most of the Order's history, this wasn't the case, and the nature of the Jedi trials was entirely subjective, up to the Padawan's master to decide. In any case, the trials were always grueling and sometimes even close to impossible. If completed successfully, however, they would earn the Padawan the rank of Jedi Knight, which was usually bestowed either by the High Council or a Jedi Master. In most respects, Jedi Knights operated the same in this era as they did in the time of the films. Jedi Knights were tasked with wandering the galaxy, seeking out and putting an end to injustice, going where the Force told them to go. They were often assigned missions from the Jedi Councils, but in this era, Jedi Knights also undertook missions of their own accord, doing whatever they felt they needed to ensure that justice prevailed in the Republic. Many Jedi Knights spent their whole lives wandering the stars, while others settled on planets across the Republic and galactic frontier, becoming Jedi Watchmen. Jedi Knights were allowed to take on Padawans of their own at their discretion. Above the rank of Jedi Knight was the rank of Jedi Master. This title was usually, but not always, conferred when a knight trained their first apprentice to knighthood, though it could also be conferred if the knight overcame a significant personal challenge, sought to establish a satellite Jedi Academy, or had simply become experienced enough that the High Council deemed them worthy. Sometimes, Jedi Knights even promoted themselves to Jedi Master after deeming themselves worthy, and though obviously this practice was frowned upon, in some cases the self-promotion was acknowledged. Jedi Masters were the best and brightest of the Jedi Order, the wisest and most gifted in the ways of the Force. In the old days, they were given a great deal of independence. While they still answered to the Jedi Councils, they often set out to form Jedi Academies of their own, forming their own sect of the Jedi Order to command. Masters alone were eligible for promotion to the Jedi Councils, and the greatest Masters in the Order were afforded the rank of Grand Master. At this time, the rank of Grand Master was inconsistent. Sometimes there were multiple Grand Masters, though there was usually only one, and sometimes there were none at all. The Grand Masters were the leaders of the Jedi Order, the greatest of all the Jedi. Together with the Master of the Order, they led the Jedi High Council. Jedi of all ranks had few possessions, living austere lives and traveling the galaxy with little more than robes on their backs. But there were a few exceptions to this rule. Personal items that all Jedi owned, the most notable of which were their weapons. In later eras, of course, these were lightsabers, but for millennia of Jedi history, the signature weapon of the Jedi Knight was instead a Force-imbued blade, sometimes known as a Jedi Katana. These were ancient weapons with a very long history, stretching all the way back to Tython, where the members of the Jedi Order first crafted these blades in the forges of Ver Tepe. The Jedi Knights continued the practice after the Force Wars, and for over 10,000 years, these weapons were the primary symbol of the Jedi Order. These swords were forged by Jedi apprentices at one of the academies on Ossus or on the other Jedi worlds, and much like lightsabers, each weapon was personalized to its creator. To make these swords, Jedi would take a bar of high carbon metal, usually durasteel, and forge it into a katana. As they hammered the blade, the Jedi would focus on the weapon with the Force, pouring the Force into the blade. The Force would change the blade's molecular structure, creating a nigh unbreakable lattice that also made the blade incredibly sharp. Once the blade was set, a Force-attuned crystal, usually an Adagen crystal from Ossus, would be set into the hilt, and the initiate would enter into deep meditation, channeling the Force into the crystal and the blade until the lattices of the two became one. Once this was done, the final step saw the initiate channel the Force into the crystal, which would infuse the weapon with energy and make the blade glow, signifying that the weapon was complete. This process was incredibly difficult, but the result was a Force-imbued blade of incredible sharpness, strength, and power, capable of parrying lightsaber blades and cutting through all but the most durable materials. These weapons were bonded to their creators, and they were as much a symbol of identity for them as lightsabers were for Jedi of later generations. But the age of the Force-imbued sword eventually came to an end, albeit slowly. Sometime between 10,000 and 7,000 BBY, the Jedi began to develop the first lightsabers, using the Adagen crystals placed in the hilts of Force-imbued blades to create blades of pure energy. The earliest proto-sabers were unstable and had to be connected via cable to a belt-mounted power pack, but years of refinement eventually made proto-sabers usable. By the start of the 100-Year Darkness in 7,000 BBY, the proto-saber had replaced the Force-imbued sword as the primary weapon of the Jedi after nearly 20,000 years. 2,000 years later, after the Great Hyperspace War of 5,000 BBY, lightsaber technology had further improved, and the first modern lightsabers, which didn't require power packs, entered use. The stage of the initiate trials that had involved forging Force-imbued swords were thus replaced with a stage that required initiates to craft their own lightsabers. This journey began with the selection of a lightsaber crystal, typically an Adagen crystal from Ossus or Ilum, though more exotic crystals were sometimes used. The other parts of the lightsaber would then be fabricated, primarily the power cell, lens fixture, and emitter matrix, and the lightsaber would then be assembled through the Force. While this process was less arduous than the forging of a Force blade, it nonetheless required extreme skill in the Force, as the crystal had to be set perfectly or else the lightsaber would explode upon activation. But as we've alluded to a few times already, the biggest difference between the modern Jedi Order and the Jedi Order of older eras was how decentralized it was. Most Jedi weren't even trained on Ossus, and many only visited the Jedi Homeworld on pilgrimages to the Eye of Ashlanei. Many of these Jedi were instead trained at satellite academies, enclaves, and outposts, which were spread all across the galaxy. Some of these Jedi temples, such as the one on Ilum, were pilgrimage sites and not inhabited full-time, while others, such as the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine and the shrine that would later become the Coruscant Jedi Temple, had permanent populations and were run by their own small councils of Jedi Masters. Other prominent Jedi academies were located on Dorin, Harath, Truine, Teia, and Arcania. Many of these satellite branches of the Order had their own unique traditions and practices, though these were usually in harmony with the broader Jedi doctrine. Occasionally, a Jedi sect would arise with views deemed heretical by the High Council, leading to the Satellite Academy being discontinued, or rarely falling to the dark side and causing a schism within the Order. This was a rarity, however. In the 21,000 years between the start of the Jedi Order's alliance with the Republic and the destruction of Ossus, there were only 4 known examples of such schisms. There were also a great many Jedi who operated independently from Ossus and from all of the satellite academies. Many Jedi Knights and Masters made their homes on remote, desolate worlds, living in meditative solitude and training Padawans that sought them out. Such was the case for the legendary Master Thon, who lived in a simple hut far from civilization on the barren planet of Ambria. In many respects, this lifestyle resembled that of the exiled Jedi Masters who survived the Great Jedi Purge, except the Masters of this age weren't in hiding and simply preferred a solitary life. There were also the Jedi Watchmen. Jedi Watchmen were a specialized class of Jedi who, rather than roaming the galaxy as knights, settled on a particular world and were formally appointed its guardian. Jedi could be appointed watchmen of individual planets or systems, or they could be assigned to whole sectors. In either case, they worked closely with the local governments and oversaw all Jedi operations within their designated theater. Watchmen answered to the Council of Reconciliation and were often closely involved with delicate political situations on the planets they were assigned to. Oftentimes, they were selected due to their familiarity with the intricacies of local cultures and customs. Jedi Watchmen were tasked with protecting and helping the people of their worlds, and it was also their job to seek out Force sensitives to train as Jedi on the planets they watched over. In this era, Jedi Watchmen usually selected a handful of Padawans from the local population, training them in the ways of the Force, together as part of a sort of miniature Jedi Academy. These apprentices would assist the Watchmen in their duties, and sometimes a Watchman's Padawan would succeed them as Watchmen. Jedi Watchmen were actually still around at the time of the Clone Wars, but they were much less common and generally much less involved with their assigned systems, generally acting more as special liaisons than permanent protectors. In the time before the destruction of Ossus, however, the Jedi Watchmen thrived, and most important systems had a Watchman assigned to them. They were given plenty of independence, trusted to make decisions regarding their assigned worlds without first consulting the Jedi Councils, and they were generally respected by the peoples they watched over. However, the golden age of the Jedi Watchmen ended with the Great Sith War, and as the Jedi Order began to centralize, the role was stripped of a lot of its significance, and Jedi Watchmen became less common, to the galaxy's detriment. The last difference between the Jedi Order of old and of the movie era was its involvement in the Republic's wars. As we discussed earlier, the Jedi Order's relationship with the Republic was much different prior to the destruction of Ossus. In general, it was an ally of the Republic but not a servant of it, at least not yet, and this was especially evident in times of war. Though several Jedi Knights fought in the Unification Wars, by and large, the Jedi Order didn't involve itself in the Republic's wars for most of its history. The Jedi were partly involved in the Taiwanese War, the Republic's very first war. Prior to the war, they had acted as a bulwark against Taiwanese pirates raiding the Republic colonies, and during the war itself, they continued to play a role in defending Republic space and helping civilians affected by the war. but they had no affiliation with the Republic military, and the Order strongly disapproved of how the Republic ended the conflict. After the Republic Navy carried out an indiscriminate, nigh genocidal bombardment of Decevero, the Taiwanese capital, in the war's last battle, the Jedi Order seriously considered breaking its alliance with the Republic, and only refrained from doing so after the Senate disbanded the Republic Navy and offered restitution to the Taiwanese to appease the Council. In the millennia that followed, the Jedi Order didn't involve themselves in the Alsacan conflicts and most of the Republic's other wars, though they did play a major role in battling Hutt-backed slavers and pirates on the Republic frontier. When the Republic was taken over by the Pius Dei cults and began a series of anti-alien crusades, the Jedi Order broke its alliance with the Republic for real this time, recusing itself from Republic affairs. It spent the Pius Dei era officially neutral, while it secretly organized resistance against the Crusaders, allowing knights errant to take to the battlefield against the Pius Dei, while the other Jedi spearheaded a conspiracy to destroy the cult from within and retake the Republic. This conspiracy was eventually successful, and in the end, the Pius Dei were defeated because of the Jedi, who also played a major role in rebuilding the Republic after the cult was gone. Following the Pius Dei era, the Jedi became much more active in Republic affairs. Indeed, the first Supreme Chancellor of the Republic after the fall of the cult was Jedi Grandmaster Beal Ductavis, who simultaneously led the Republic and the Jedi Order. Following the end of the Ductavis era, the Jedi steadily became involved in more of the Republic's wars, helping the Republic survive the Waymancy Storm and the many crises of the post-Mandarin period, sometimes even fighting alongside the Republic military on the front lines. The Jedi Order also endured conflicts of its own over the course of its history. The first of these, the First Great Schism, happened scarcely 500 years into the Order's alliance with the Republic, and saw the Jedi Order battle and defeat the legions of Leto, an army of dark Jedi led by the fallen knight Zendor. This war was brief, but the next one, the Second Great Schism, was not. This schism took place more than 17,000 years after the first, and it was also known as the 100-Year Darkness, as it saw the Order battle an army of dark Jedi and the monsters they created for a full century. The end of that conflict wasn't as decisive. The Dark Jedi were defeated and their monsters were slain, but 12 of the fallen Jedi survived, and instead of executing them, the Jedi exiled them from known space. In doing so, they ended up creating a threat that would define the next few millennia of Republic and Jedi history: the Sith. But the Jedi Order's involvement in the Sith Wars is another story entirely. That wraps up our look at how the Jedi Order functioned before the destruction of Ossus. We hope you've enjoyed, but what do you think? The Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Republic, the servants of the light and protectors of the weak. They were close allies of the Republic for 25,000 years, but as we described in a recent video, the nature of that alliance and the structure of the Jedi Order itself changed over time. In this video, we'll be discussing the Jedi's role in the period that caused these dramatic transformations, the Sith Wars, which tore the galaxy apart and forced the Jedi Order to adapt, evolve, and ultimately become much more closely joined with the Republic. The Jedi were not warriors, and for most of the Republic's history, they weren't really involved in its wars. Occasionally, they fought as allies alongside the Republic military, and on one occasion, they fought against the Republic, but typically, the Order considered the Republic's wars to be the Republic's business, and the Jedi spent these periods of conflict helping the innocents that would inevitably be caught in the crossfire. Only when there was a truly grave threat that the Council believed threatened galactic civilization would the Jedi Order go to war. But in the later millennia of Republic history, such threats became increasingly common. The Sith were the reason for this. Following the Jedi Order's Second Great Schism, the 100-Year Darkness, which began in 7000 BBY, the exiled Dark Jedi conquered the Sith of Korriban and Ziost, declaring themselves the first lords of the Sith. They fused Dark Jedi techniques and those of the native Sith to form the Sith Order, and for 2,000 years they ruled over a brutal empire in the remote reaches of the Outer Rim, where they plotted revenge against the Jedi and the Republic. In 5000 BBY, after a pair of Republic hyperspace scouts stumbled upon Korriban and unintentionally offered the Sith a route into the heart of Republic space, the Sith took their chance and the first of many Sith Wars began. Previously, the Wars of the Jedi and the Wars of the Republic had mostly been separate affairs. The Republic's wars were political or territorial in nature, while the Jedi Orders were usually battles with sects of dark Jedi, which the Order could handle on its own. But the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY was a fusion of the two, as the Sith Empire was both a threat to the Republic and a league of Darksiders, more powerful than the threats faced by the Republic and the Jedi before. The Jedi Knights thus fought side by side with the Republic military against the invaders, thwarting the Sith attack on Coruscant and the core worlds. Over the course of the next few years, the Jedi then led Republic military forces in an assault on Sith space, destroying the Sith Empire and apparently destroying the Sith teachings as well. In the Great Hyperspace War, the Jedi Order fought in defense of the Republic, and in the process, it was fighting against the armies of the dark side. Later wars with the Sith, who obviously survived their defeat in the Great Hyperspace War, would follow in a similar pattern. Over the course of the next few thousand years, these conflicts would lead to a steady shift in how the Jedi thought about the Republic. Over time, they would start to believe that fighting in defense of the Republic was fighting against the dark side, even when their enemies weren't Sith. This shift wasn't immediate, of course. Once the Great Hyperspace War was over, the relationship between the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic largely went back to the way it was before. The Jedi did assist the Republic in many smaller conflicts during the post-Mandaron period, but these were all defensive, and the Jedi continued to treat the Republic as an ally rather than a master. The Jedi also had to deal with their own schisms in this time, most notably the Third Great Schism of 4250 BBY, which culminated in the Voltar Cataclysm, in which the Dark Jedi of that schism inadvertently killed themselves. For a time, it seemed that the Great Hyperspace War would be the only conflict of its kind, but 1,000 years later, it became apparent that the Sith were still out there. It began with the emergence of Freedon Nad, a Sith Lord and fallen Jedi who set himself up as a tyrant on Onderon. Nad was defeated by the Jedi, but his legacy endured on Onderon, and eventually it gave rise to other Sith cults. From the Narratists came the Krath, who took over the Empress Teta system, and eventually the Sith Lords themselves returned. In 3997 BBY, Jedi Knights Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma fell to the dark side and became the new Dark Lords of the Sith. They forced an eclectic alliance of Sith followers and set out to wreak havoc across the Republic. The resultant Great Sith War was very brief, but it was absolutely devastating for the galaxy. Countless Republic worlds were ravaged by the Krath, the Mandalorians, the Massassi, and the other servants of the Sith before Qel-Droma was captured and Kun was destroyed. And the Jedi Order suffered even worse damage. Unlike the previous generation of Sith, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma were not invaders from outside the Republic, but traitors from within the Jedi Order, and their promises of a new golden age of Sith resonated with many of the younger Jedi. A lot of these Jedi had been recruited at an older age, had families, or had other factors that made them susceptible to the dark side, and Exar Kun exploited this to turn hundreds, if not thousands of Jedi to his side. Some of them joined him outright, becoming members of the Brotherhood of the Sith and joining the war against the Republic. Others lay in wait, biding their time, until one day, when Exar Kun gave the word, they rose up and butchered their masters. This event was known as the Jedi Pogrom, and it was devastating for the Jedi Order. The Jedi splintered into factions as apprentices turned against their masters, Darksiders battled those still loyal to the light, and the resultant chaos spread all across the galaxy. Many of the Jedi Order's wisest and most powerful Jedi Masters were caught at unawares and slain, and many promising apprentices were lost, either to the dark side or to the blades of Kun's followers. But the worst was still yet to come. Toward the end of the Great Sith War, Exar Kun ordered the use of an ancient Sith superweapon that tore out the core of one of the stars that made up the Kron cluster, an open cluster of 10 stars in close alignment. The star went supernova, and its destruction set off a massive chain reaction, causing the entire Kron cluster to destroy itself. The Kron cluster itself was largely uninhabited, but it lay very close to the Ossus system, close enough that the supernova threatened to cleanse Ossus of life. With very little time, the Jedi Order had no choice but to evacuate their ancient homeworld. As they did so, the Sith arrived. While the Mandalorian Crusaders attacked the evacuation ships and caused chaos in the skies, Kun, Keldroma, and a small team of Massassi landed on the planet to loot it of the many artifacts that the Jedi kept there. Keldroma was captured, but Exar Kun and his Massassi escaped with a horde of stolen artifacts, which they took to Yavin 4. Many other artifacts, as well as countless texts stored in the Great Jedi Library, were unable to be evacuated, and the Jedi were forced to leave them behind. Most of the Jedi were able to evacuate Ossus before the blast from the supernova reached the planet, but others were left behind, as were the majority of artifacts and texts the Jedi had stored on the planet. Many of these were destroyed, while the remainder were buried in the ruins of the Jedi libraries and vaults. There, they remained for millennia, as the Kron supernova formed the Kron Drift, a debris field and remnant nebula that rendered hyperspace travel to Ossus all but impossible. The Jedi and the Republic won the Great Sith War in the end, but the Jedi Order had been devastated by the conflict. In the end, the Jedi had lost thousands of Padawans, Knights, and Masters, including most of the oldest and wisest Masters in the Order. The Jedi had lost their homeworld, and with Ossus, they not only lost numerous temples, academies, and other facilities, but an enormous amount of lore, teachings, and artifacts. The Sith had wiped out 20,000 years of Jedi history, and the Jedi would spend the bulk of the next few decades struggling to rebuild and re-examining the doctrines of their order to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. There were a few decades of peace after the end of the Great Sith War, and the Jedi spent them licking their wounds and rebuilding from the destruction of Ossus. Everything that had been salvaged from Ossus was moved to nearby Exus Station, where, in the next decade, several Jedi conclaves were held to determine what the future of the Jedi Order would look like. One of these conclaves appointed war hero and prodigy Nomi Sunrider Grand Master of the Order, and under her direction, the Jedi regrouped and eventually relocated. After some debate, the Jedi Enclave on Coruscant, formerly a small peripheral academy, was chosen for expansion into a new, much larger Jedi Temple, which would become the new home of the Jedi Councils and what remained of the Jedi Archives, as well as the Order's new primary training center. Other satellite temples and academies remained in operation, most notably the Dantooine Jedi Enclave and the Jedi Temple on Ilum, and new ones were even established in this period, such as the Taurus Jedi Tower. But the Order's leadership relocated to Coruscant, where the new Jedi Temple rapidly took shape, becoming a defining feature of the planet's skyline. While the Order was easily able to relocate to a new headquarters, it had a much harder time rebuilding its knowledge base. Many teachings were lost forever with Ossus, as were many artifacts, and while most that remained were brought to the new Jedi Archives on Coruscant, which was quickly filled with replacement texts for those lost with Ossus, the Order's archivists were determined to not let such catastrophic losses happen again. Many texts were duplicated and spread to the archives of other Jedi academies, such as the Dantooine Enclave, while important artifacts were spread out across the Jedi Order's academy network. Many were taken to a secret redoubt the Order established in one of Telos 4's polar irrigation stations, which was converted into a place the Jedi could retreat to, taking all their lore with them should catastrophe strike again. It wasn't just the location of the Jedi Order's headquarters that changed in this period either. Jedi doctrine was adjusted as well. Many members of the new Jedi High Council, most prominently Vrook Lamar and Atris, argued that the lax policies and decentralized structure of the Jedi Order had been major contributing factors in the fall of so many Jedi to the dark side. In the 40 years after the end of the Great Sith War, the Jedi Order thus became a more centralized institution, and several of its doctrines changed. Many of the Jedi who followed Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma, as well as the two Lords of the Sith themselves, had joined the Order at an older age, had been part of a group of Padawans trained by a single master, and had been trained on more remote outposts of the Order. Many also had close attachments with other people. Atris, in particular, frequently pointed out that Qel-Droma had fallen due to attachment, and that the first Great Schism had been started by two lovers. As a result, the Jedi Order instituted new rules that forbade masters from training more than one Padawan at a time and restricted the recruitment of older Force sensitives. Going forward, the Jedi would almost exclusively recruit children who were raised apart from their families at a Jedi Academy, and if those initiates achieved the rank of Padawan, their master would train them and only them. These rules weren't as strict as they would later become, though later revisions to these rules lowered the age at which Jedi could be recruited. During the Sith Wars, older children and sometimes young teenagers were allowed to be taken in for training. While masters were forbidden from taking multiple apprentices at a time, Padawans weren't as firmly bonded to their masters, and many Padawans sought extensive training from masters apart from the one they were assigned to. Jedi of Padawan rank were generally still much more independent, allowed to seek instruction from whatever master they wished and travel the galaxy independently. Apart from the official rules the High Council instituted in this period, there were also several unspoken norms that were established. Jedi were discouraged from contacting their birth families going forward, though it wasn't forbidden, and romantic relationships also started to be strongly discouraged around this time. This last measure was initially controversial, however, and though romantic attachment became taboo and was even considered to be forbidden by some, it would be many years before it became officially forbidden. Additionally, the Jedi Order slowly began to centralize during this period. Due to the casualties the Order had suffered, the Jedi Watchmen ceased to exist after the Great Sith War, and though they were later reformed, the practice of Jedi setting off on their own, settling on random worlds and training whatever Force adepts they found there, largely ended. Going forward, almost all Jedi would be trained at the Jedi Academies, where their training could be standardized and apprentices could be watched more closely for signs of the dark side. As a consequence of this, within a generation, most of the Jedi in the galaxy lived at the Jedi Temple or one of the satellite enclaves rather than being spread across the galaxy. This led to an increase in the authority of the Jedi Councils, especially the High Council, which started to take a more direct role in micromanaging the Order, though the councils of the satellite academies still had a fair bit of authority. Many of the smaller Jedi outposts had been lost or abandoned during or after the Great Sith War. However, it would still be some time before most of the Order lived at the Coruscant Jedi Temple. The Coruscant Temple may have been the Order's headquarters, and many Jedi relocated there after the destruction of Ossus, but many satellite facilities retained their prominence. The academies on Dorin and Teia persisted as major satellite academies, while new facilities were founded on Taris, Telos, and Alpharides. The Jedi Temple on Ilum became much more important since, with the destruction of Ossus, it was now the Jedi Order's main source of Adagen crystals. Perhaps the most important satellite academy in this era was the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine, a small, remote facility that nonetheless trained large numbers of Jedi and was managed by several members of the Jedi High Council. The Dantooine Enclave was remote and secret, all but unknown to non-Jedi, so it effectively became the secondary headquarters of the Jedi Order, a hidden stronghold the Jedi could rely on in times of crisis. Indeed, the Dantooine Enclave ultimately became the de facto headquarters of the Jedi Order during the turmoil that was to come. Just a few decades after the defeat of Exar Kun, the Republic found itself embroiled in yet another conflict of enormous scale, the Mandalorian Wars. After Exar Kun's defeat, the Mandalorians had reformed themselves, grew stronger, and had begun to conquer sectors beyond the Republic's borders. The Republic, unwilling to get involved in another war so soon, did nothing. But before long, the Mandalorians turned their attention to Republic space, and the Republic military was woefully unprepared to deal with their invasion. The early stages of the Mandalorian Wars saw the Mandalorians win battle after battle, rampaging across Republic space and becoming stronger with each planet conquered. The Republic, with no one else to turn to, begged the Jedi for aid, but the Jedi Council refused to get involved. The Order had yet to fully recover from the catastrophic losses it suffered in the war with Exar Kun, and the Jedi also had their own issues to deal with at this time, as it was busy dealing with the Jedi Covenant, a rogue, radical sect within the Order that made a play for control of the Order under the cover of the Mandalorian threat. But on top of that, many on the Council sensed that the Mandalorian Wars weren't what they appeared to be. They felt that some darker force was behind the Mandalorian invasion, and the Council ultimately decided that it needed to study the threat in greater detail to ascertain what had driven the Mandalorians to invade before it went to war. The decision was made with the understanding that the Jedi would join the war eventually, but some Jedi were unwilling to wait. Many of the younger Jedi were outraged at the Council's inaction. Led by two talented knights named Revan and Malak, they argued that innocents were dying by the millions out on the Rim, and that they as Jedi would go out to save them whether the Council approved or not. The Jedi Council warned them against joining the fight, fearing that the brutality of the war would draw some of the younger Jedi over to the dark side. But these Jedi Crusaders refused to listen. At Revan's command, they broke with the Order, enlisted in the Republic military, and took the fight to the Mandalorians. The Senate gratefully accepted their support and appointed these Revanchists to the rank of general, with Revan and Malak appointed the Republic military's supreme commanders. The Mandalorian Wars marked the first time that Jedi were directly integrated into the Republic's military hierarchy. In previous wars, the Jedi had been deputized into Republic service as a mercy corps. They fought for the Republic, but they did so on their own as a sort of separate unit. But in the Mandalorian Wars, the Revanchists took direct command of Republic forces, becoming the first Jedi generals. The first, but not the last. They led Republic forces to victory in the Mandalorian Wars, beating the Mandalorians back out of Republic space and then pursuing them into the Outer Rim, where Revan and his followers utterly destroyed the Mandalorian fleet at Malachor 5. In the process, however, the Revanchists were changed by the war, just as the Jedi Council had feared would happen. Revan and his followers found that victory sometimes required them to make moral shortcuts, sacrificing some lives to save others, and slowly, this mentality, fueled by the trauma of war, led them down the path of the dark side. The Mandalorian Wars ended in 3960 BBY, but the Republic had only a few months of peace before the next war began. This time, the invaders weren't Mandalorians, but a new Sith Empire, one founded and led by Revan and Malak, who proclaimed themselves the new Dark Lords of the Sith. Many in the Republic chose to join them. In the Republic military especially, large portions of both the army and navy were more loyal to the heroes of the Mandalorian Wars than to the Senate, and these soldiers defected to join the Sith. All of the Jedi who went to war with Revan had fallen to the dark side, save only Mitra Surik, who had lost her connection to the Force at Malachor 5. Surik had actually returned to Coruscant to face trial, following which she was exiled from the Jedi Order. Her place in the ranks of Revan's army was quickly filled, as many other Jedi defected over the course of Revan's war, having become disillusioned to the Council's inaction in the Mandalorian Wars, swelling the numbers of Revan's dark Jedi followers. This time, the Jedi Council took action immediately, going to war on behalf of the Republic against this new Sith threat. The Jedi Civil War had begun. In the Jedi Civil War, the Jedi went back to operating as a mercy corps instead of generals, but due to the greatly weakened state of the Republic military and the defection of many of its top officers to the Sith, the Jedi still essentially commanded Republic forces in the war, with the Jedi Council working directly with the Republic military's top commanders to oversee the conflict. The Jedi and the Republic were at a constant disadvantage throughout the war, as the Sith Empire had a seemingly limitless fleet at their disposal, and Revan's tactical genius was unmatched. But the Republic held together thanks to a young Jedi named Bastila Shan, a master of battle meditation. In the end, Revan was captured and had his mind wiped by the Jedi Council, who programmed him with a Republic-loyal identity in the hope that he would help them stop Darth Malak, the new ruler of the Sith Empire. Revan did exactly that, and against all odds, the Republic emerged victorious from the Jedi Civil War. But the cost was devastating. The Republic lay in ruins, and the Jedi Order had suffered tremendously. It had never truly recovered from the Great Sith War, but the fall of the Revanchists, the defection of many of the younger Jedi, and the casualties suffered during the Jedi Civil War further diminished the Order's numbers. Revan converted or killed as many Jedi as possible during the war, dispatching hunter-killer droids, Sith assassins, and non-Force sensitive Sith commandos to eliminate as many Jedi as possible. And by the war's end, barely over 100 Jedi remained. Many of the galaxy's academies and outposts were destroyed or abandoned over the course of the war as well, killing many Jedi Masters and destroying even more Jedi lore and artifacts. The Jedi Enclave on Dantooine effectively became the Jedi Order's headquarters over the course of the war, which caused more tragedy when the Dantooine Enclave was located and destroyed by the Sith near the close of the conflict. The Jedi Order had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, and the worst was still yet to come. In the initial period after the end of the Jedi Civil War, the few Jedi who remained slowly started to disappear. Sometimes, individual Jedi would turn up murdered. At other times, many of them would be lost at once. As the casualties increased, what remained of the Jedi High Council called for a conclave on Katar, a Mirror-Luke colony where the remaining Jedi would meet and attempt to discern the threat that was stalking them. In a sense, they succeeded. Their presence drew Darth Nihilus, one of the Sith who was hunting them, and Nihilus destroyed all life on Katar, wiping out most of what remained of the Jedi Order. Those few Jedi that hadn't gone to Katar were all that remained, and after this disaster, they went into hiding, switching off their lightsabers and scattering. The Jedi Order, as far as the galaxy knew, had disbanded. It was around this time, in 3951 BBY, that Meetra Surik, the Jedi Exile, returned to known space. The Sith, believing her to be the last of the Jedi, immediately set out to kill her, and in response, Surik set out on a quest to locate the lost Jedi, the survivors of the Order who had gone into hiding. On Telos 4, she had a chance encounter with Master Atris, one of the Council, and from Atris's archives, she discovered that several other Jedi Masters were alive, scattered across the galaxy. She set out to find them and bring them to the ruins of the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine, believing that the Jedi needed to come out of hiding for the Sith to be stopped. Along the way, Surik slowly regained her connection to the Force, and as she gathered allies on her adventures, she began to train them in the Jedi ways. By the time all the surviving Jedi Masters had been found, the Exile had trained 6 students: the deserter, Aton Rand, former engineer Baldur, the bounty hunter Myra, the ex-Sith Visas Ma, an Ichani handmaiden named Brianna, and a Jedi washout known as the Disciple. In the end, Surik returned to Dantooine, where 3 Jedi Masters, all former members of the Jedi Council, had gathered. The Exile implored them to take action against the Sith, claiming that they had revealed themselves and the galaxy would fall if they didn't act quickly, but as they had a decade prior, the Council insisted on waiting. The Masters argued that the true threat still hadn't revealed itself and that the best course of action was to remain in hiding. They even refused to recant Surik's sentence of exile and attempted to once again cut her off from the Force. This drew the ire of Darth Traya, who killed the 3 Masters before they could carry out their sentence. Traya herself was defeated by Surik and her allies soon thereafter, as were the other Sith and Atris who had fallen to the dark side. But by that point, all the surviving Jedi Masters were dead. But this was not the end of the Jedi Order. The true lost Jedi, the apprentices that Meetra Surik had gathered and trained, set out and found other Jedi in hiding, and together they rebuilt the Order. Many of them would go on to sit on the re-established High Council and train apprentices of their own, as the exile had trained them. With the Sith threat vanquished, at least for a time, the Jedi Order could finally recover, and it would recover under the guidance of Jedi who were less dogmatic, less conflict-averse, and overall less orthodox than those that had come before them. Above all, they were Jedi who vowed that the Order would never abandon those who needed their help again. The end of the Dark Wars was not the end of the Jedi Order's struggles. In fact, just 300 years after the rebuilding of the Order began, a new round of wars with the Sith began. By this point, the Jedi Order had rebuilt enough to play a major role in defending the Republic against the galaxy's latest Sith Empire, but once again, it suffered serious casualties in the war, and the Jedi Temple was all but destroyed in the sacking of Coruscant, forcing the Jedi to relocate to Tython. Nonetheless, the Jedi rebounded again, and the Order's situation during the Galactic Wars was never as dire as it had been in the aftermath of the Jedi Civil War. In the centuries following the final defeat of the Sith Empire and the end of the old Sith Wars, the Jedi Order was finally able to rebuild and recover from the damage it had suffered. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was rebuilt, and its archives were returned to their former glory. The ranks of the Jedi Order recovered, and the Jedi were once again able to return to their role as the guardians of peace and justice in the Republic. But as the Order began to thrive once more, it did so in a different form. All the destruction the Jedi had suffered changed them as an Order, both in terms of doctrine and in terms of structure. The old Sith Wars saw the vast majority of Jedi academies and enclaves in the galaxy destroyed from Ossus to Dantooine, and while satellite academies continued to exist after the wars, the vast majority of Jedi began to relocate to the temple on Coruscant. The centralization of the Order continued, and though the Order of Jedi Watchmen was resurrected and some Jedi continued to act more independently from the Order, Watchmen were now more beholden to the councils, and Knights Errant became increasingly rare. Jedi doctrine changed in this time as well. Despite the unorthodox training and views of the exiled students who had refounded the Order, the Jedi High Council ultimately maintained its rules forbidding Jedi from training more than one Padawan at a time, and the Order continued to exclusively recruit children. The discouragement of romantic attachments slowly became a rule of the Order as well. But the most important doctrinal changes were the Order's relationship to the Republic and how the Jedi viewed their role as peacekeepers. The students of the exile had seen the consequences of the Jedi Council's inaction in the Mandalorian Wars and Dark Wars, and they were determined to never let that happen again. Going forward, the Jedi Order would be much more proactive in going to war when they believed it was necessary to protect innocence or to preserve the Republic. As we mentioned earlier, so many wars between the Republic and the Sith had slowly convinced the Jedi that the servants of the dark side wanted to topple the Republic, and so any enemies of the Republic came under immediate suspicion as proxies of the Sith, just like the Mandalorians had been in the Mandalorian Wars. The Jedi Order became increasingly defensive of the Republic, and as a result, it became much less critical of the Republic's abuses and much more institutionally linked to it. Partly, this was in reaction to the Sith's hatred of the Republic, but it was partly due to an increasingly common view among the Jedi that, while the Republic wasn't perfect, it was necessary for galactic civilization, and there was no better alternative for it. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, many of Mace Windu's students quote him to students of their own. Jedi do not fight for peace. That is only a slogan, and is as misleading as slogans always are. Jedi fight for civilization, because only civilization creates peace. For Mace Windu, for all his life, for all the lives of 1,000 years of Jedi before him, true civilization has had only one true name, the Republic. When Windu's talking about civilization here, he's referring to a very specific kind, a cooperative, pluralistic, democratic society built on peaceful collaboration instead of violent conquest. And the Republic was indeed the only major power in the history of the Star Wars galaxy to come close to that deal. It wasn't perfect, but it was a hell of a lot closer to true civilization than the Sith Empire. But after years of contrast between the Republic and the Sith, the Jedi had started to lose sight of the ways in which the Republic fell short of that ideal, to the eventual detriment of the Order and the galaxy as a whole. And while the Jedi Order wasn't officially an arm of the Republic just yet at this stage of the timeline, it was still increasingly committed to the Republic's defense, and in the next chapter of galactic history, the Republic would need a whole lot of defending. 2000 BBY saw the start of the Jedi Order's fourth Great Schism, fought against the followers of a former Jedi Master named Phaneus, a solipsist who had left the Order after the Council had rejected his beliefs. Phaneus sought out the last remnants of the old Sith Order, which had been reduced to tiny, isolated cults on the fringe of the Outer Rim, from whom he learned the Sith ways. Phaneus declared himself Darth Ruin and amassed an army of followers, led by defectors from within the Jedi Order. These followers became the new Sith, and they made war on the Jedi and the Republic. Darth Ruin was slain not long after he declared himself, killed by a group of his own students, but another Dark Lord rose to take his place, and the new Sith Wars would continue off and on for the next 1,000 years. Once again, the Jedi Order was called upon to defend the Republic. The new Sith Wars were unlike the old Sith Wars, as the new Sith were not an empire, but an exceptionally schismatic and disorganized network of Sith cults and petty states. They were spread across the galaxy, all waging their own small wars against the Republic, the Jedi, and each other. Few of the new Sith sects were all that strong on their own, but they rapidly multiplied so that each sect the Jedi destroyed was soon replaced. Thus, the new Sith subjected the Republic to a death by 1,000 cuts, slowly wearing it down until it began to collapse under its own weight. The Jedi did the best they could to slow the Republic's decline, even taking up roles as generals in the Republic military, but they could only do so much. After the Battle of Mizra in 1466 BBY, the Republic all but ceased to exist outside of the Greater Core, and most of the galaxy fell into chaos. It was up to the Jedi Order to stop the bleeding. As the Republic began to fall apart, the Jedi Council took increasingly direct control of it. For a few hundred years, the position of Supreme Chancellor was consistently held by Jedi, often the Jedi Grandmaster, and the Jedi took direct control of the Republic military. By essentially micromanaging the Republic, the Jedi Council just barely kept it from dissolving altogether, but the Republic was still greatly reduced in scope. By 1100 BBY, the Republic barely existed, having withdrawn to a few small pockets of territory in the core and along the major hyperspace lanes. The HoloNet shut down beyond the borders of Republic space, leaving most of the galaxy sectors cut off from each other, beginning a century-long period known as the Dark Age of the Republic. Even as the borders of the Republic shrunk, however, the Jedi continued to fight to protect the people of the sectors it had abandoned. Many Jedi Knights followed the example of the old Jedi Watchmen, striking out into the Rim and taking charge of remote sectors that desperately needed their help. Some of these Jedi were Knights Errant, roaming the Rim and fighting to protect the innocent from whatever pirates and Sith they encountered, but many settled on planets in the Rim and became their permanent guardians. Like the Watchmen of old, they trained apprentices from among the Force sensitives of their planets, and many of them even had children who succeeded them as the Jedi protectors of their homeworld. Slowly, these new Watchmen became Jedi Lords, the rulers and guardians of the sectors they kept safe from the Sith, who gave them hereditary estates and titles in gratitude. The Jedi Lords raised armies to defend their territories and became the leaders of small sects of Jedi, much as the Watchmen of old had been. Together with their students and their followers, these lords led the fight against the Sith, while the Council managed the Republic. The Council, for its part, really didn't like the Jedi Lords. Apart from the whole reinventing feudalism thing, which the Jedi Council was pretty justifiably cautious about, the Lords and their followers were fast and loose with Jedi doctrine, having families and running petty states out on the Rim. They didn't answer to the Council and did more or less as they pleased. The Lords, for their part, didn't like the Council either. They saw the Council as dogmatic and unwilling to do what needed to be done. Nonetheless, the two did manage to work together well enough most of the time, and together, they kept the new Sith from bringing about complete civilizational collapse. In the final decade of the new Sith Wars, the Jedi Lords pooled their forces under the banner of the Army of Light, governed by the new Jedi Grand Council. They fought a 10-year war with the Brotherhood of Darkness, which had, in turn, united all of the new Sith under its banner. The two armies clashed for the final time on the lonely planet Ruusan, where the Sith were believed destroyed at long last, albeit at great cost to the Army of Light. With the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the new Sith Wars ended and the Republic, against all odds, had survived, entirely thanks to the Jedi. The Republic rebuilt quickly after Ruusan, and as it did, it instituted a series of reforms known as the Ruusan Reformations. These reforms affected not only the Republic, but the Jedi as well. Per the Ruusan Reformations, the Army of Light was disbanded and the position of Jedi Lord was abolished. Sectors returned to ordinary government, and all Jedi were once more brought under the authority of the High Council. The High Council, in turn, was brought under the authority of the Senate. The new Sith Wars had made the alliance between the Republic and the Jedi closer than ever before, such that the two had effectively become one entity. The Ruusan Reformations formalized this, making the Jedi Order an official part of the judicial forces, subject to the orders of the Senate. After millennia of development, the Jedi Order finally took the form we know from the prequel trilogy. Without a doubt, the lightsaber is one of the most recognizable weapons of all time. Even non-Star Wars fans recognize them on sight. But for such an iconic weapon, not many people know the history and technology behind them. As you might expect from a contained plasma sword, lightsabers were complicated tools, and when you add crystals and the Force into the mix, things get strange fast. We're willing to bet that even you, the viewer, will learn something new. In today's video, we'll be diving deep into the lore surrounding Jedi lightsabers, from a brief overview of their history to what components were necessary for them to function, different variations one could make using different styles, the entire ritual behind its construction, and last but not least, the crucial philosophy that any Jedi had to internalize before they were ever allowed to come near a lightsaber, never mind build one. Despite how intrinsically the lightsaber is connected with the idea of the Jedi, it wasn't the first weapon of choice the Order standardized. In its early years, the Jedi Order relied on a type of Force weapon sometimes referred to as a Jedi katana. To make their very own Force weapon, the Jedi would take a bar of high carbon metal, usually durasteel, and then forge it into a katana-like sword. During the forging process, the Jedi had to concentrate on imbuing the weapon with the Force, pouring energy into the blade as it took shape. This altered the blade's molecular structure, resulting in an almost unbreakable material that was unbelievably sturdy, but also unbelievably sharp. After the blade had been forged, a Force-attuned crystal would be set into the sword's hilt by channeling the Force into it and the weapon until the two became one. Once the process was complete, the blade would glow. The resulting blade was nigh impenetrable, capable of parrying energy weapons and cutting through most substances. This entire process was highly personalized, and thus, the weapons each Jedi forged was unique to them, much like lightsabers were in later years. But with the advancement of technology, more intricate and powerful weapons were slowly developed. Sometime between 10,000 and 7,000 BBY, the Jedi began developing the first lightsaber prototypes by focusing raw energy through Force-attuned crystals built into cylindrical hilts, which would result in a blade of pure energy. These were the proto-sabers, the beta version of the lightsaber. They were mostly similar to modern lightsabers, but were more unstable and needed to be connected to an external belt-worn power pack that was connected to the proto-saber by a power cable. However, the Jedi worked on refining this new type of weapon, and by the outbreak of the 100-year darkness in 7000 BBY, the proto-saber had completely replaced the Jedi katana. 2000 years after that, lightsaber technology had developed further, and the first modern lightsabers were constructed. These didn't require an external power source, which made them far more viable as a weapon. When the Sith adopted the lightsaber, they began a tradition of using red-colored sabers, which we'll get into a little later. During the Great Sith War, many Jedi who joined Exar Kun kept their Jedi sabers, which had their original colored crystals, but the Jedi Civil War reintroduced the concept of an army of Sith wielding exclusively red lightsabers, and the Crimson Blade became a staple for the Sith moving forward. For the rest of its history, the lightsaber remained mostly the same. Advancements in technology provided new materials for their hilts to be made out of, or new sources of crystals might be discovered, but the lightsaber itself, in concept and practice, remained unchanged, a stable reference point for a Jedi Order that underwent many reformations. So let's take a look at what this final design looked like and which components made up this signature weapon. As many of you probably know already, the way a Jedi constructed their saber was deeply personal to them, reflective of their personality, their history, cultural backgrounds, and fighting styles. However, regardless of the designs they picked, each lightsaber was made up of the same basic components. The average lightsaber hilt was between 24 and 30 centimeters long, though this could also vary wildly depending on the user's size. Regardless of its length, every mechanism that worked together to produce the lightsaber was housed within the hilt. All in all, most lightsabers consisted of 10 components in total, each with a very specific order of placement within the hilt. At the very top was the blade emitter, a lens that covered the lightsaber's energy beam into a blade of superheated plasma. The emitter also forced the plasma to loop back in on itself. There were many emitter designs a Jedi may choose, from a simple cylinder to crescent moon shapes curving outwards or spikes that protruded outwards. Part of this structure was the emitter matrix, which kept a tight magnetic grip on the beam of energy once it was extended. During the saber's construction, it was crucial that this matrix was oriented the right way, because if it wasn't, the blade would be sent inwards instead of outwards, causing the saber to explode. Right beneath the blade emitter was the focusing lens. This lens's job was to regulate the length of the lightsaber blade, ensuring it would stop at a set distance. These were responsible for shorter lightsaber blades, such as those for smaller-bodied Jedi, and for the blades of Exar Kun's famous saber staff, whose length he could alter mid-combat. Beneath the focusing lens were the energy modulation circuits and the cycling field energizers. Not much is known about their exact role in the saber's function, but the former most likely functioned as tools to convert the energy of the saber into plasma. Nestled within a specialized chamber in the heart of the saber was the focusing crystal, a placement directly tied to the crystal code. The crystal is the heart of the blade. Much like in their first iterations, these force-attuned crystals were arguably the most important part of the lightsaber and the one that carried the most significance for the Jedi. Alongside the crystal, all sabers also had an energy core. Canon and legends differ here in what role these two components played together. According to canon sources, the lightsaber crystal focused the energy produced by the power source, resonating as the energy passed through it and giving the blade its properties. For example, Kylo Ren's saber used an unstable crystal, which gave the blade that characteristic flickering look. Most sabers were built with one focusing crystal and two power crystals, the latter of which strengthened the blade and granted it unique properties in some cases, but one would also work just fine. The energy core, typically a rechargeable Datium power cell, was what powered the saber, sending energy through the focusing crystal. In legends, however, the crystal itself was the source of the saber's power, and the power came directly from it. Meanwhile, the energy core was little more than a battery that was used to activate the saber. However, beyond turning the saber on, the energy core didn't supply the saber with energy per se. Rather, an activated lightsaber functioned as a closed circuit, with energy looping from the battery through the blade and then back to the battery. It's up to you which version you find the most logical. For the purposes of this video, we'll be going with the Legends explanation, but whenever we encounter any other differences between the two sources, we'll still be pointing them out. Beneath the power cell was the inert power insulator. This component was added to protect the saber user from any energy discharge. Finally, at the base of the saber hilt was the pommel cap, which was another highly customized component. Its primary purpose was to seal the bottom of the hilt, but oftentimes a backup power cell was stored in the pommel just in case a Jedi was caught unprepared. But this was all inside the hilt. Externally, the hilt had many other customization options such as personalized grips, ridges, textures, and so on. Many sabers had a power button which activated the saber, but these weren't mandatory. In fact, sabers could be activated with the Force alone. Another external mechanism was the blade power adjustment knob, which moderated the power output of the saber. Thanks to this knob, the lightsaber could go from powerful enough to cut through durasteel to training mode, which was the lowest power setting used during training. When in training mode, the blade was so weak that if it came into contact with sentient skin, it would cause a mild burn and nothing more. So how did all these components work together to make a saber's blade function? First, the energy cell would be activated, sending a stream of energy through the kyber crystal which focused it. This would be converted into plasma, then refined through a series of field energizers and modulation circuits before the emitter took all that and turned it into a solid beam of energy. The blade would extend about 1 meter in length on average before the containment field forced it to arc back in on itself toward a negatively charged fissure around the emitter. From there, it was channeled back toward the power cell through superconductors, which would close the circuit. The containment field was also responsible for making the blades feel solid when connecting with other lightsabers rather than passing through each other. As we mentioned earlier, variations in these individual components could change the overall lightsaber design, even if the core mechanics remained the same. These design changes evolved into the different types of lightsaber variations. We've already dedicated an entire video to the different kinds of light weapons the Jedi have used across the ages, but for the purposes of this video, we'll go over a few basic ones. First, there's the curved lightsaber. Rather than the hilt being a straight cylinder, in the case of this specialized tool, the saber's hilt formed a curve that could fit within the palm of the hand and tilt downward, allowing for the saber's blade to essentially become an extension of the user's arm. The curved hilt was usually wielded by dedicated Form 2 practitioners like Count Dooku, whose curved lightsaber is the go-to example for this weapon. Another basic variation that depended on changes to these basic components was the great saber. In principle, the great saber was identical to a lightsaber, just larger. The hilt was longer and wider, and the blade was designed to extend beyond the usual length of a lightsaber. Great sabers were necessary for larger species, as the length of a saber was directly proportionate to the user's size. Along the same vein was the Shoto, a lightsaber with a shorter hilt and blade. For some Jedi, this was used as an offhand complement to the regular lightsaber main hand, but for some Jedi of smaller stature, the Shoto replaced the lightsaber as the main hand. Yoda was a good example of this, as his saber was significantly smaller to match his tiny frame. Another famous canon example was the vented or crossguard lightsaber, also known as that crossblade Kylo Ren uses. In the case of this saber, the emitter wasn't designed to just emit the blade, but also two smaller blades on either side to form a crossguard. Along a similar vein was the double-bladed lightsaber, which featured a double-ended hilt. Rather than the hilt having the emitter at the top and the pommel cap at the bottom, once we reached the power cell, the structure repeated until we reached a second blade emitter at the other end, allowing for two blades to exist at the same time. These were independent of one another and could be activated separately if the wielder wanted, offering greater range and flexibility. On a slightly different note, another way a Jedi could personalize their lightsaber was by waterproofing it. It's unclear what exactly a Jedi had to do to make a saber waterproof, but amphibious species, like the Nautilans, famously ensured their lightsabers could function underwater. As a final and more extreme example of a lightsaber variant was the Light Whip, a weapon that resembled a lightsaber hilt, but the blade it emitted was longer and whip-like. The difference here was in the containment fields and energizers, as they allowed for different shapes, lengths, and flexibility to the emitted blade. At the end of the day, no matter what bells and whistles you added to your lightsaber, The most important part of it was the crystal, the heart of the blade. But as you already surely know, these weren't just random crystals you bought at a market, and they meant a heck of a lot more to the Jedi than their emitter or pommel cap. But before we get into the why, let's discuss the what. What exactly made these crystals special? As we've mentioned, the crystals used for lightsaber construction weren't any ordinary crystals. They were incredibly rare, Force-attuned crystals, often called living crystals. They were connected to the living Force, and through this connection, the Jedi could form bonds with them, but more on that later. The most common form of lightsaber crystal was the kyber crystal, but other rarer variations also existed. These crystals were nigh indestructible, capable of focusing and amplifying energy. Lightsaber-worthy crystals were found on planets with an extreme concentration of Force energy, like Ilum, Ossus, Jedha, or Dantooine. And of course, the color of the crystal is what determined the color of the lightsaber blade. This is another moment in which canon and legends differ. In canon, lightsaber crystals were always clear. When a Force user found one and bonded to it, the crystal would shift color to match the user's personality, thus determining its color. For example, Obi-Wan Kenobi would have found a clear crystal, and after meditating with it, his crystal would have become blue, resulting in his blue lightsaber. In Legends, the color of the crystal was dependent on the type of mineral it was and on the planet it was found. For example, in the icy caves of Ilum, you could only find blue, green, and rarely purple crystals, whereas up on the snowy mountaintops, you could find magenta crystals. On Dantooine, you would commonly find yellow and orange crystals. An extension of this disagreement is the two different ways canon and legends handle red lightsaber crystals. According to canon, red lightsabers weren't really a naturally occurring option. To get a red lightsaber crystal, the Force user had to take a crystal and bleed it, pouring all their hatred and pain into it. Remember how we said these crystals were connected to the living Force? Darksiders would abuse this connection to break the crystal spirit. Once it resonated with the user's pain and anguish, it turned red as a result. In Legends, on the other hand, there were a very, very rare few naturally occurring red lightsaber crystals, but for the most part, the red crystals used by the Sith and other Darksiders were synthetic. These synthetic red crystals were created in specialized blast forges that allowed Darksiders to channel their anger and hatred into the crystal to shape and refine it, producing a corrupted and utterly unnatural crystal after a few days forging. On the flip side of this difference were white crystals. In canon, you got a white lightsaber crystal by cleansing a previously bled red crystal, whereas in Legends, white crystals were just a very rare type of crystal found in the digestive tract of giant worms, among other places. Now, we're gonna spare you the Jedi horoscope game of what does my lightsaber color mean. There are plenty of theories out there for what kind of Jedi got what kind of crystal. Traditionally, Jedi Guardians got blue, Jedi Consulars got green, Jedi Sentinels got yellow, Mace Windu got purple, and everyone else got whatever made them feel extra special. In reality though, regardless of whether you vibe most with canon or legends, the color of the crystal didn't matter. What mattered was the bond between them and the Jedi, the unbreakable, unique connection that took the crystal from a piece of living mineral to the heart of the saber, and the Jedi from a single person to the crystal of the Force. But before the Jedi could attune their crystals and begin constructing their sabers, they first had to actually collect their crystals. In some cases, this was as simple as hunting down a mineral and collecting it. However, it was common for older Jedi and mandatory for the children collecting their first crystal ever to go about collecting their crystals through a ritualistic process known as the Gathering. We're sure you remember the eponymous episode of Star Wars: The Clone Wars, where a group of younglings, supervised by Master Yoda, traveled to Ilum to collect their first lightsaber crystals. The Gathering ritual could be performed in other crystal caves, such as on Jedha or Dantooine, but traditionally, the Jedi preferred the icy caverns of Ilum, so we'll be focusing on those as an example. Naturally, this wasn't as easy as walking into the caves, picking up a crystal, and walking back out. Lightsaber crystals were found on planets strong in the Force, and through their connection to it, the Force was an active participant in the ritual, testing the hopeful Jedi venturing into its depths. As shown in The Gathering and Jedi Fallen Order, there was a deliberate way the crystal caves had been prepared. The entrance to the cavern was sealed by a thick sheet of ice that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. At the entrance to the caverns, the Jedi had built a mechanism that used prisms to focus the sunlight from Ilum's sun and channel a focused beam at the entrance that could melt the ice. However, from the moment the ritual began, the Jedi within were on a timer. The moment the sun moved out of position, the sunbeam would cease hitting the door and the thick plating of ice would reform, trapping the would-be crystal prospectors within. That's why the Gathering was a time-sensitive ritual, or at least that's how it was presented to the Padawan. Be quick or be trapped within. We'd like to believe Jedi teachers weren't so cruel that they would actually leave a Padawan trapped inside, but that's a topic for a different video. Once a Jedi entered the caves, they had one sole objective: finding their crystal. Again, this wasn't just any crystal. In a glittering cavern filled with glowing crystals, the Jedi had to open themselves up to the Force, allowing it to guide them in the right direction. What determined the right crystal for a specific Jedi wasn't its size or shape or color, but the Force resonance it gave off, its connection to the Force, and through it, to the Jedi. By opening themselves up to the Force, however, a Jedi was simultaneously tested. As it guided them, so too did the Force test them. Within the crystal caves, a Jedi had to face their darkest fears and insecurities. Thoughts that sounded like their innermost doubts would whisper through their minds, testing their resolve. In short, the Force would make a Jedi confront their weaknesses and fears, and only by overcoming them and persisting in the face of doubt, only by trusting in the Force would a Jedi succeed and find their way to their crystal. And once they'd found the crystal that was destined for them, it was a matter of reaching out and plucking it from the rock. With their crystal now in hand, the Jedi began the simultaneously arduous and simple task of constructing their lightsabers. There were two different aspects to constructing a lightsaber: physically selecting and assembling the components, and spiritually attuning the crystal. Despite their vastly different nature, both processes relied heavily on the Force. When selecting the components for their lightsabers, Jedi were encouraged to personalize their hilts as much as possible. In the Star Wars The Clone Wars episode immediately following the Gathering, a test of strength, the young Jedi who had just collected their first crystals were guided by Huyang, the ancient saber artificer, on how to construct their first saber. In the case of these younglings, Huyang simply brought out a giant box filled with components of all shapes, sizes, and materials. Instead of rifling through the box and choosing their components, the younglings were taught instead to meditate on the Force and allow it to guide them in selecting their pieces. Rather than focusing on what looked cool or other superficial factors, Huyang taught them that what they needed to listen to was their heart and allow their sabers to reflect who they were on the inside. Only then would the saber truly reflect who they were as Jedi. Regarding the components themselves, these could be from a variety of materials, from durasteel to wood. Huyang and the Crucible, the ancient Jedi ship that he was in command of, had many different textures and styles on hand to allow for maximum optimization. As an example from this episode on the series, the Wookiee Padawan Giorgi ended up selecting components made from the wood of the Brylark tree, which reflected his cultural origins on Kashyyyk. We have to assume that, as the Jedi grew older, wiser, and more aware of their specific needs, the assembly process was much more deliberate. A Makasha user, for example, would intentionally go for a curved hilt. A Jedi that wanted to build a lightsaber blaster combo would intentionally choose those components. However, there was still an element of letting the Force guide them in constructing it, even if it was to a lesser degree than that very first time a youngling built their lightsaber. To an extent, the rituals surrounding that first lightsaber assembly were a necessary part of a young Jedi's education. The lightsaber, after all, was the symbol of the Jedi Order. Wielding it wasn't a right, but a privilege, and the many layers of ritual that went into building it were there to truly impress upon the Padawan the true importance and gravitas of the moment. From the moment they pushed their activator buttons and turned on their lightsabers for the very first time, They were a representative of the Jedi Order in the galaxy, wielding a tool powerful enough to cut through metal and vaporize flesh. It was a responsibility the younglings could not take lightly, and the many elders who guided them along the way were there to ensure they understood just how important this moment was. On the other hand, attuning the lightsaber crystal to themselves was a far more difficult process. A test of strength doesn't show the process, but we have other depictions of it. In the past, we've discussed how the Force was living energy that permeated every living being, forming connections between us. It was the task of the Jedi, who represented the will of the Force, to strengthen those connections. By doing so, they supported balance and life itself. The crystal attunement process was an extension of this same concept. By allowing themselves to enter a deep meditative state, the Jedi would reach through the Force and find that connection between themselves and the crystal that had chosen them. To attune the crystal, they had to strengthen that connection between themselves and the crystal until their bond was so strong that they were one. A good mental image is that, before the attunement process, the Jedi and the crystal each resonated at their own unique frequency. By deepening their bond, these two frequencies came ever closer until the Jedi and crystal resonated as one. When younglings were first taught how to attune their crystals, they were taught the Crystal Code, an offshoot from the main Jedi Code. The crystal is the heart of the blade. The heart is the crystal of the Jedi. The Jedi is the crystal of the Force. The Force is the blade of the heart. All are intertwined. The crystal, the blade, the Jedi. You are one. In 7 short lines, the Crystal Code embodies this very notion that the Jedi and crystal are a single unit, a pair bonded for life, profound connection forged through the Force itself. It is the Force that connects the pair, but it is the crystal and the Jedi that resonate together. This profound connection is the basis for the canon lore that it was the Jedi's personality that determined the color of the crystal. Simultaneously, it's the reason why a Jedi just couldn't select any random crystal. The Force guided them to that crystal that was already very close to their own frequency, a crystal that was already close to reflecting their spirit. By guiding the crystal to mirror them more, a Jedi poured themselves into it, and depending on what type of person they were, the crystal would change to reflect their inner selves. Only once their crystals were fully attuned were the Jedi ready to activate their sabers. It's unclear which of the two processes came first. We would argue it doesn't matter, really, but it would make more sense to us if the longer, more difficult attunement process would come first. For starters, the attunement process was one of self-discovery. Through it, the Jedi had to take a good look at themselves in order to imprint that upon their crystal. Throughout the process, they would become more familiar with who they were as a person, and by extension, they would better understand their needs in a lightsaber. A secondary aspect is that Padawan constructed their first lightsabers when they were still young, and it would be far easier to have the crystals ready to slot into their completed hilts once they were done rather than have them wait. Either way, once the crystal was attuned and slotted securely into the completed hilt, all the Jedi had to do was activate the saber and watch it come to life. Assuming everything had been done correctly and the lightsaber didn't explode in the Jedi's face, they now wielded a weapon of a legendary power. We doubt we really need to go into extreme detail to truly impress upon you just how powerful the lightsaber was. Since the lightsaber's blade was made up of a continuous stream of superheated plasma, it could essentially cut through most materials. Jedi were able to cut through heavy blast doors or slice rifles in half like they were nothing. There were only a handful of materials that were lightsaber resistant, such as Beskar, Frick, and Cortosis, but they were extremely rare and expensive, leaving most opponents with no way to Jedi-proof their equipment and facilities. Since they could be made waterproof, not even hiding your facility underwater could protect against the cutting power of the lightsaber, as the Inquisitorius found out. When striking a living creature, the lightsaber's blade was so hot it vaporized a clean path through whatever it touched. When used to amputate a limb, the lightsaber left behind a wound so thoroughly cauterized, the victim wasn't at risk of bleeding out. On the other hand, if an opponent used the lightsaber against you, there were very few armors that would do anything to protect you. Stormtrooper armor, for example, was as easy to slice through as styrofoam with a chainsaw. And even if that weren't enough, the Jedi were very thoroughly trained to wield their weapons. Millennia of Jedi had perfected the various schools of lightsaber combat, otherwise known as the 7 lightsaber forms. If you haven't seen our video on each individual form explained, we highly recommend it. To keep a long story short here, each form represented a different school of thought and a different response to a specific need. Makashi, for example, was designed to deal with Shicho's sweeping motions. Ataru was designed to overwhelm Makashi users. Shien was developed to counter Ataru and deal with multiple opponents at once. As the millennia passed, the Jedi adapted to their opponents, making them formidable enemies in every period. All you have to see to understand just how OP Jedi were is to rewatch The Phantom Menace and see just how much of an impact the arrival of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon has on the Battle of Naboo. Jedi were incredibly powerful, more powerful than any other individual warrior, and oftentimes more powerful than entire platoons of individuals. But as an old uncle might say, with great power comes great responsibility. Jedi weren't only taught how to use their lightsabers, but also when, and the philosophy behind the use of lightsabers is one of the most fundamental yet least talked about aspects of Jedi ideology. At the core of this philosophy lies the principle that Jedi should only draw their lightsabers when absolutely necessary. To many Jedi, this was the single most important lesson when it came to lightsaber combat, and thus, the principle was named Form Zero to symbolize that it was the basis that knowledge of all other lightsaber forms should be built upon. There are many quotes that encompass this idea scattered through canon and legends. A Jedi should only draw their lightsaber if they are prepared to kill, is one such quote that many of you are likely familiar with. Kyle Katarn mentions that, remember, your lightsaber is an invaluable tool. Even when inactive, it can diffuse a potentially volatile situation. Trust me on that. While Yoda reminded younglings that the best blades are kept in their sheaths. All of these quotes illustrate the same core idea. A lightsaber is a tool, not a weapon, and as such, it should only be used when necessary. Diplomacy was the true purpose of the Jedi, not combat, and rushing to draw one's lightsaber when more peaceful means were available could easily escalate a situation into violence. The true purpose of the lightsaber was to be a symbol of justice in the galaxy, not a vehicle for violence and domination as the Sith used it. Sometimes, Form Zero taught, just the presence of a Jedi and their lightsaber could be enough to deter other participants from escalating a situation, and in this case, the threat of the lightsaber was more than enough. The first quote we mentioned is a fan favorite precisely because of how potent it was. Given how powerful a lightsaber was, a Jedi couldn't draw it on their opponent without knowing that a possible outcome has now become them taking their opponent's life. As Jedi, the keepers of life, this wasn't an outcome any Jedi should take lightly, and if they weren't prepared to kill, they shouldn't be drawing their weapons first. What Form Zero called for was restraint, discipline, and deliberation. A Jedi had to weigh all their options, trusting in the Force to guide them into seeing options that might not be immediately obvious. If there was another way to defuse a situation without escalation, then a Jedi was expected to find it. If not, they were expected to use aggressive negotiations only to the point they were absolutely necessary. To many practitioners of Form Zero, it was the first form a youngling had to learn before they could receive any further instruction in martial skills. Otherwise, young Jedi ran the risk of impulsively throwing themselves into combat and becoming what some in the fandom call saber monkeys, Jedi who could do little more than resolve a situation with violence. Of course, a Jedi could wield their weapon in self-defense when needed, or in the defense of others. At the end of the day, the lightsaber was a tool to be used for the good of the galaxy. A symbol of the Jedi Order that upheld the will of the Force. A tool capable of as much good as destruction. It was up to the Jedi to live up to that responsibility. The Jedi Order was one of the most ancient orders of Force users in the galaxy, having operated under more or less the same doctrine and general hierarchy for more than 25,000 years. Naturally, an ideology that's been around for so long would see variation over the years, however, and in the Jedi Order, this manifested in the form of sects within the Jedi Order. Some of these were like fellowships within the Order, informal groupings of Jedi with similar interpretations of Jedi doctrine or approaches to the Jedi way. Others were subgroups of the Order, some authorized by the Council and some not. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the most significant of these Jedi sects, from the most well-known to the obscure. We're going to start by looking at the three main branches of the Order: the Guardians, Sentinels, and Consulars. These three groups represented a different approach to and philosophical outlook on what it meant to be a Jedi Knight, and they represented the main internal ideological distinctions between Jedi. These three branches all worked together well despite their differences. They were specializations rather than competing sects. They differed primarily in tactics and their approach to the Force, and in overall ideology, they were generally the same, all being followers of the light and adherents of the Jedi Code. Each branch had its own traditions, and traditionally, members of the three branches were identified by the colors of their lightsabers. Guardian sabers had blue blades, Consulars had green blades, and Sentinels had yellow blades, though this was just a tradition and not a rule, and Jedi were still free to choose whatever color they wanted. The Jedi Guardians, the largest sect, believed in direct action as a solution to injustice, and focused on honing their combat skills and physical capabilities. The Jedi Consulars were revered all over the galaxy as diplomats and arbiters, trained primarily in non-combat related techniques. The smaller sect, the Jedi Sentinels, adopted a sort of hybrid approach, focusing on learning as many skills as they could so as to root out the dark side wherever it could be found. We'll focus on the Jedi Guardians first. In the words of Jedi Guardian Crix Sunburus, the Guardians were the Republic's first line of defense against the 1,000 enemies that sought to destroy it, and just the way that's phrased speaks volumes about the Guardians' view of the galaxy. The Guardians were fighters, and they specialized in the use of physical force to bring an end to injustice. Some Guardians saw themselves as warriors, but this was something wiser Jedi cautioned against. Guardians were still Jedi, after all, and they were called to use violence only when necessary to protect the lives of the innocent. The Guardians nonetheless had a more offense-oriented and direct approach to this than the other branches of the Order. Consequently, they prioritized skill in lightsaber combat more than the other branches did, and they also emphasized physical fitness and combat readiness. Guardians' study of the Force typically focused on techniques that were applicable in combat. In a sense, the Jedi Guardians were what many people's first impression of a Jedi Knight was. They traveled the galaxy, battling pirates, slavers, and darksiders wherever they could be found, acting as keepers of the peace and protectors of the innocent on the fringe of Republic space. During the Sith Wars, the Guardians fought on the front lines against armies of the dark side. When evil reared its head, it was usually the Guardians that would respond first, charging in with lightsabers blazing. When not out on missions, Guardians spent most of their time engaged in rigorous training exercises, with most spending no less than 3 hours a day running, sparring, and practicing saber cadences or unarmed combat drills. As a result, Guardians were typically the physically strongest Jedi, as well as generally the most skilled in lightsaber combat. They used the Force to bolster these skills, enhancing their strength, speed, and resistance to pain. Generally, they were the most skilled in combat-oriented Force abilities, such as the aforementioned performance-enhancing techniques, Force jump and similar abilities, and offensive telekinetic techniques. All told, Guardians were the Jedi you'd want by your side in a fight. They were typically less prepared for non-combat situations, however. Guardians often neglected their study of the Force techniques that didn't have combat applications, or of non-combat skills, disciplines, and teachings, and when subtlety or negotiation were necessary, Guardians usually weren't the best choice. Some Guardians were further specialized, filling specific roles within the Jedi Order. The most well-known Guardian subgroup was the Jedi Peacekeepers, who were more like patrolmen than warriors, the most prestigious of whom were the members of the Temple's security, the Jedi tasked with protecting the Jedi Temple, whose ranks included the Gate Master. There were also Jedi Aces, gifted pilots who specialized in using the Force to excel in starfighter combat. The Jedi's lightsaber instructors were usually Guardians, appointed by the High Council and handpicked by the most skilled and experienced Jedi Guardian of each Jedi Academy, who was given the title of Jedi Battlemaster. Other skilled Guardian Jedi Masters were given the title of Warrior Master, which was mostly honorary and simply identified a particularly skilled guardian. Many warrior masters were also members of the last sect of guardians, the weapon masters. These Jedi were masters of physical combat on a level that surpassed all other Jedi, and most devoted their lives to the mastery of a particular weapon, either a lightsaber or a more exotic weapon such as a quarterstaff, whip, flail, rare lightsaber variants, or even one's own body. Jedi weapons masters learned techniques that gave them increased strength and an innate resistance to pain, and those who chose to study the lightsaber were typically the best duelists in the Order. Moving on, we're going to discuss the Jedi Consulars next. In contrast to the Guardians, the Consulars focused on the more cerebral applications of the Force, and more than any other Jedi branch, they prioritized finding non-violent solutions to problems. Jedi Consulars were revered across the galaxy as healers, seers, and above all, negotiators. Like the Guardians, they spent their days saving lives, but while Guardians did this through direct action, Consulars could end entire wars without ever drawing their lightsabers. On the whole, Consulars were the most rational and level-headed of the Jedi, and their ranks included many of the Order's most revered members. They placed a low priority on the practice of combat techniques and the use of the lightsaber, but Consulars were unparalleled in their wisdom, knowledge of diverse topics, and in the use of the Force. Study of the Force was paramount in the life of a Jedi Consular. Most Consulars knew a wealth of Force techniques, often including several obscure ones, and they spent much of their time in meditation, concentrating on the Force to better understand its will. But the Jedi Consulars were not a cloistered sect, and they too embarked on missions across the galaxy, helping the innocent wherever they could. Typically, they did this either through application of the Force, be it in combat or otherwise, or more commonly, through negotiation. Consulars were also routinely deployed as diplomats, teachers, researchers, or in other roles that allowed them to improve or even save lives without ever drawing their lightsabers. In these capacities, they often used the Force to sense deceit and ulterior motives, allowing them to cut to the chase in negotiations and create lasting peace. When combat was necessary, however, Consulars could still be quite effective. Their command of the Force made them tough opponents, allowing them to perform all sorts of techniques. The most powerful Consular techniques allowed them to rally their allies in battle, strengthening and coordinating them. And while Consulars were typically neither all that physically strong, at least for Jedi, nor the most practiced lightsaber duelists, Consulars were still Jedi, and their lightsabers were still to be feared. Some of the most devastating lightsaber duelists in the Jedi Order's history, including Yoda, Kit Fisto, and Shaak Ti, were Consulars, and while most Consulars were less skilled, they weren't pushovers by any means. Many Consulars were masters of the Niman form, which combined aspects of all the other forms of lightsaber combat to create an effective and versatile technique that paired well with creative use of the Force. Like the Guardians, the Jedi Consulars had many specialized subclasses that their members could join. The greatest of Consulars were given the title of Sage Master, and the 5 most prominent Sage Masters made up the Council of Reconciliation, one of the 4 Jedi Councils, which was solely composed of Consulars. This council worked closely with the Republic Diplomatic Corps, and all Jedi ambassadors and diplomats answered to it. Ambassadors and diplomats were 2 of the most prominent consular specializations. Ambassadors served as the face of the Republic on far-flung worlds, representing the Council and the Senate to non-Republic members, while diplomats did the grunt work of negotiation and diplomacy, both within the Republic and between its members. Other consulars were considered Jedi researchers, an umbrella term that described Jedi who devoted their lives to scholarship. They were biologists, linguists, geologists, astronomers, archaeologists, or members of some other discipline, devoting their lives to these academic pursuits, as well as study of the Force. They worked closely with the Lawkeepers, the Jedi who maintained the Order's vast archives, whose ranks included the roles of archivist, librarian, and historian. Another consular sect was the Jedi Seers, a very rare group of Jedi whose extraordinary connection to the Force gave them unusually strong insights into the Force's will and its unifying nature, allowing them to see the future. The greatest seers were the Jedi Prophets, whose visions were recorded and studied by the Lawkeepers. Lastly, there were the Jedi Healers, who did exactly what their names suggested. They used the Force to heal wounds and save lives, and they were quite good at it too. While Force healing was a fairly common Jedi technique, only the healers were good enough to use it to full effect, bringing critically wounded beings back from the brink of death and healing those who were beyond the ability of medical science to treat. Lastly, we have the Jedi Sentinels, the rarest Jedi class. Sentinels combined elements of the Guardian and Consular paths with a heavy emphasis on learning practical, non-Force related skills as well. In the words of Jedi Master Dorak, the Sentinels ferreted out deceit and justice, bringing them to light. Sentinels were some of the most vigilant against the threat of the dark side, and in confronting this threat, they emphasized the importance of flexibility and not relying on one tactic. They spent considerable time studying both the Force and the lightsaber, but they also recognized that combat skills and the Force couldn't solve every problem, and so most Sentinels were also well versed in non-Force related skills, including many that were uncommon for Jedi. As a result, Sentinels tended to be the Jedi who got the missions neither the Guardians nor the Consulars wanted, and they became adept at solving problems that other Jedi couldn't. While Guardians and Consulars traveled the galaxy on missions, Sentinels frequently stayed in one place for extended periods of time, devoting themselves to the protection of individual worlds or communities. This led many Sentinels to become Jedi Watchmen, and even those that didn't serve as Watchmen were generally practical, capable, and equipped with a better understanding of civilian life than Jedi of other disciplines. Jedi Sentinels kept combat ready, honing their lightsaber skills and meditating on the Force, but they didn't prioritize either. Instead, their focus was typically on developing civilian skills such as stealth, slicing, infiltration, treating wounds, picking locks, and even things like espionage and sabotage. As a result, Sentinels were fairly well-rounded. When it came to combat or negotiation, a Guardian or Consular would fare better, but the wide skill sets of the Sentinels allowed them to complete the missions that more specialized Jedi just weren't suited for. They were given many of the Jedi Order's odd jobs, and out in the field, they tended to be very service-oriented, focusing on helping the people of the galaxy in ordinary, practical ways, rather than through combat or negotiation. Sentinels tended to keep a low profile and preferred more subtle uses of the Force that allowed them to remain unnoticed. The most well-known Sentinel techniques made them resistant to incapacitation and dark side Force techniques designed to instill fear in the target. As with the other two branches, Sentinels had a wide variety of subclasses. Many of these were just Sentinels that were particularly adept with a certain skill, such as Jedi Slicers, tech experts, and security experts, whose roles were fairly self-explanatory. These Jedi mastered skills that most Jedi neglected, making them invaluable when those skills were needed. Sentinels also served as the quartermasters of the Jedi Academies and as Jedi Watchmen, and Sentinels also made up the entirety of the Jedi Temple Guard, whose yellow-bladed lightsabers demonstrated their allegiance to this sect. Some Sentinels were Jedi artisans, who honored the Force by making cool stuff in their spare time, while others were Jedi investigators, who acted as detectives, trackers, and sometimes even spies on long-term missions. One of the most important Jedi Sentinel roles was that of Jedi recruiters, who went around the galaxy looking for Force-sensitive children that showed the potential to be Jedi. The last and most interesting Jedi Sentinel specialization was the Jedi Shadows, a subsect of elite Sentinels that were tasked with hunting down and eradicating all traces of the dark side. The Jedi Shadows answered to the Council of First Knowledge, which dispatched these Sentinels across the galaxy to contain or destroy dark side artifacts and apprehend or terminate Darksiders. Their missions were difficult, secretive, and extremely dangerous, and due to the nature of their role, Jedi Shadows were allowed to study dark side techniques beyond what would normally be allowed for Jedi, as they stood a high chance of having to defend themselves against them. Additionally, Jedi Watchmen were sometimes considered an extension of the Sentinel discipline, and while not all Watchmen were Sentinels, many were. We've talked about the Watchmen already in this series, but for the sake of completeness, let's take a quick look at them again. Jedi Watchmen were appointed as the permanent guardians of particular planets or systems, or in some cases, whole sectors. In any case, they worked closely with the local governments and oversaw all Jedi operations within their designated theater. Watchmen worked closely with the Council of Reconciliation, as they tended to be very familiar with local cultures and political situations within their theater of influence. In older eras, Jedi Watchmen would form their own little Jedi academies, selecting students from among their planet's population and training them as Jedi. These apprentices would assist the Watchmen in protecting the people of that particular planet or sector. In later eras, Jedi Watchmen weren't permanently stationed in their territories, but they continued to act as special envoys and protectors of the regions they were assigned to. Speaking of Jedi sects we've already mentioned, let's return to the Jedi Lords. During the New Sith Wars, as Republic authority began to collapse, large swaths of the galaxy were left in a state of anarchy. With a lack of Republic support and the failure of the HoloNet, these worlds were cut off from their neighbors and from galactic trade. Many sank into poverty and chaos, and the receding borders of the Republic left them at the mercy of pirates, slavers, and Sith. But many Jedi were unwilling to leave these sectors to their fate, and these Jedi set out to act as the protectors of these rimwood sectors. They initially acted as classical Jedi Watchmen, but as the years went on and their home sectors came to rely entirely on them for defense, they were granted political power and even hereditary estates. They became Jedi Lords, titles they passed down to their children in a quasi-feudal system. The traditions of the Jedi Lords varied from lordship to lordship, but they were generally independent and often bent the rules of the Jedi Order, much to the displeasure of the High Council, which frequently clashed with the Lords. The Lords established their own council, the Jedi Grand Council, which consisted of the galaxy's Jedi Lords. This council coordinated the Jedi Lords' efforts against the Sith, and in 1010 BBY, it united the forces of the Lords under the banner of the Army of Light, led by Seneschal Hoth. This army was divided into the 7 Legions of Light, each led by one of the most powerful Jedi Lords. Within each legion were several minor lords, as well as the knights and apprentices loyal to them, and the non-Jedi armies the Lords had amassed over the years. The Army of Light ultimately destroyed the Sith in the Ruusan campaign, but it suffered grievous losses in the campaign's final battle, and it was disbanded following the Ruusan Reformation. The Reformation also abolished the Jedi Grand Council and the Jedi Lordships. Most Jedi Lords subsequently gave up their titles and assimilated back into the Order, though they continued to keep a close eye on their home sectors. A few Lords stubbornly persisted for a short while, but in a matter of decades, the Jedi Lords had died out. Their legacy, however, survived in the form of 2 Jedi subsects, the Corellian Jedi and the Tipo Paladins. Now's the point where we begin to talk about actual Jedi sects, groups within the Order with controversial or heterodox views on some topics. All the sects we're going to be talking about today were still in harmony with the Council and upheld the code to some degree, though the Council still didn't like most of these sects. Thus, we won't be discussing any fallen Jedi groups or sects like the Potentium that the Council considered heretical. We'll start with a subgroup that exemplifies the kind of Jedi sect we're going to be talking about from here on out, the Corellian Jedi. Also known as the Green Jedi, the Corellian Jedi were a group of Jedi from Corellia who maintained a strong sense of Corellian identity. They were loyal to their homeworld over the Republic and were, as Corellian Jedi Koran Horn put it, notoriously contrary and bent on going their own way. They operated separately from the rest of the Order, working out of a Jedi Enclave on Corellia, and they rarely took missions outside of the Corellian sector. All told, the Green Jedi mostly fit the stereotype for Corellians. They were stubborn, patriotic, suspicious of non-Corellians, and firmly committed to their own ways. This repeatedly brought the Corellian Jedi into the High Council, though the Corellian Jedi remained part of the Jedi Order and continued to follow the Jedi Code. Nonetheless, the Corellian Jedi had a few traditions that set them apart from other Jedi. Most famously, they wore green robes, as green was the traditional national color of Corellia, and they also allowed their members to have romantic relationships and start families, leading to the development of long bloodlines, powerful Corellian Force sensitives. The Corellian Jedi typically followed the Corellian government's lead in galactic politics. When Corellia enacted Contem Planis Hermi, an ancient clause of the Galactic Constitution that allowed it to recuse itself from Republic affairs and close the borders of the Corellian sector to the outside galaxy, the Corellian Jedi typically followed suit. This most notably happened during the Clone Wars, when Corellia used the clause to remain neutral in the conflict. However, A number of Corellian Jedi broke ranks over this policy and followed the lead of the Jedi Council in fighting in the conflict. The Corellian Jedi were ancient, and in their original form, they were all but destroyed by the Sith during the Cold War. However, they rose to new prominence during the new Sith Wars when they came under the leadership of a Corellian Jedi Lord. The reigning Jedi Lord at the time of the 7th Battle of Ruusan, Lord Barathon, was one of the 7 leaders of the Army of Light, and one of only 2 of those 7 to survive the final battle. Barathon was also among the Jedi Lords who refused to give up his title. After the Ruusan reformations, he and his followers returned to Corellia, where they remained stubbornly independent, if still more or less in communion with the rest of the Jedi Order. Another Jedi sect followed a similar path after the Ruusan reformations, the Teepo Paladins. These were the followers of a minor Jedi Lord named Teepo, who advocated the use of blasters and other, more common weapons alongside lightsabers. For this, and a few other heterodox beliefs, the Teepo Paladins were actually censored by the Jedi Council at one point, though they were never expelled from the Order. The Paladins were known for wearing sensory-dampening masks into battle, which heightened their connection to the Force. Little else is known about them, apart from the fact that they themselves had a more radical sect known as the Grey Paladins. The Grey Paladins were still Jedi and adherents of the light, but they believed that other Jedi were too dependent on the Force, and they regarded the Force as a secondary aspect of their lives, rather than the focal point of it. This caused considerable contention with the Council, and even with the mainstream Teepo Paladins, for obvious reasons. A somewhat similar Jedi sect was the Altessian Jedi, the followers of Jedi Master Jyn Altis. They had a number of heterodox traditions, which included allowing their members to have families and train multiple apprentices, and they also operated apart from the mainstream Jedi Order. The Altissians traveled the galaxy acting as aid workers, showing up on backwater worlds or the sites of major disasters to help those in need. Despite their unusual traditions, they still worked with the High Council on occasion, including during the Clone Wars. One of the most obscure Jedi sects, and one of our favorites, were the Iron Knights, who almost entirely adhered to the traditional teachings of the Jedi Order, but who were ostracized by the High Council for little reason other than anti-droid bias. The Iron Knights were members of an unusual sentient species from the planet Orax known as the Shards. These were crystals that, though they defied most rules of biology, were not only alive, but sentient. They were unique in many respects, and one of their unique traits was that they could enter in a sort of symbiosis with droids. When integrated into a droid's circuitry, the Shard's personality would fuse with the personality of the droid, resulting in a single hybrid entity. And like with all life forms, the Force flowed through the Shards, and some Shards were even Force-sensitive. A group of Force-sensitive Shards were trained in the ways of the Jedi by the unorthodox Jedi Master Akinos, who trained the Shards without the approval of the Jedi High Council. Akinos spent over a decade teaching his Shard students to use the Force on the frigid planet Dweem, and over time, the Shards became model Jedi. They even built their own lightsabers, using the remains of their ancestors as focusing crystals. These bizarre Jedi droids were known as the Iron Knights, and after Master Akinos granted them knighthood, they began participating in missions on behalf of the Republic. However, the concept of Iron Knights was controversial among the Jedi. Many Jedi Masters were unwilling to accept the idea of a Force-sensitive droid, or even a living crystal. They excommunicated Akinos and his apprentices for heresy, and the Iron Knights set out the rest of the Republic era in exile on Dweem, for the most part, though a few did fight in the Clone Wars, with one falling to General Grievous in the Battle of Dagobah. Nonetheless, the Iron Knights remained loyal adherents of the Jedi Way, and they represent perhaps the strangest of all the Jedi sects. The next category of Jedi sects were groups of Jedi that you could consider the fringe radicals of the Order. Jedi whose devotion to Jedi ideology was more extreme than the High Council or the rank and files. This manifested in different ways, and in some cases, it led to corruption within these groups, drawing the members of a few down the path of the dark side. Going in reverse chronological order, let's start with the Sixth Line, who operated during the Galactic Wars. These guys were Jedi who called for adding a sixth line to the Jedi Code. There is no contemplation, there is only duty. In keeping with this, The members of the Sixth Line were real do-what-needs-to-be-done types, and in the Galactic Wars, they fought tooth and nail against the Sith. They rejected the Jedi Council's tendency to carefully debate courses of action before moving against the Sith. The Sixth Line's policy was to follow what they believed the will of the Force to be without hesitation or second-guessing. Perhaps surprisingly, the members of the Sixth Line never succumbed to the dark side, though they were possessed and destroyed by the Sith Emperor, so they didn't get a happy ending either. The Revanchists had a somewhat similar philosophy, and it led them to a much darker place. We've talked about these guys a billion times before, so we'll give you the short version. The Revanchists were a group of young Jedi Crusaders who followed Revan and Malak to a war against the Mandalorians, becoming generals in the Republic military. They were distinguished from the mainstream Jedi Order not by ideology, but by a difference of opinion on a single matter of policy, whether or not the Jedi should intervene in the Mandalorian Wars. While the Council said no, the Revanchists believed that this was the wrong decision, and so they went to war anyway. Ultimately, the war changed them. Revan, Malak, and all their followers were slowly corrupted by the dark side due to the brutality of the conflict, and after the end of the Mandalorian Wars, they became a new generation of Sith. Another Jedi sect operating around the same time was the Jedi Covenant. The Covenant was a secret cult within the Jedi Order entirely devoted to a single goal: preventing the return of the Sith by any means necessary. The Covenant operated primarily through watch circles, small groups of Jedi stationed across the galaxy tasked with detecting signs of a Sith resurgence. Each watch circle consisted almost entirely of consulars, specifically seers, with the sole exception being a single guardian per watch circle who served as the executor of the watch circle, recording what the other members saw. The watch circles were tasked with probing the Force for any potential signs of a Sith resurgence, and they were stationed on the Republic's borders to serve as the first line of defense against a new Sith threat. The Jedi Covenant also operated through Covenant Shadows, secret agents who had had all identifying information about them purged from the Jedi archives and Republic records. These shadows tracked down dark side artifacts, which they gathered in a vault at the Covenant's fortress. The Jedi Covenant was ultimately brought down from within by a dark Jedi infiltrator named Hazin, but even before that, it had been corrupted by the dark side. The members of the Jedi Covenant hated the Sith, and ironically, this slowly made the Covenant's members into Darksiders. Lastly, let's talk about the Jedi Service Corps. These weren't sects, per se, but Jedi-run organizations mostly composed of Jedi washouts. In a sense, they could be considered the washout equivalent of the 3 Jedi branches we started with, but we've moved them to the end because, obviously, the members of the Service Corps weren't true Jedi, though they still had limited skill in the Force and adhered to the precepts of the Jedi Order. The most well-known Service Corps was the Agricultural Corps, whose members used the Force to nurture plants and assist in agricultural production. Though assignment to the Agri-Corps was often seen as a punishment by eager Jedi younglings, the work done by the Agri-Corps was actually crucial for many civilizations across the galaxy. The Agri-Corps helped the Republic maintain a healthy food supply for the galaxy, with Agri-Corps members assisting in the growth of crops on agri-worlds like Tanab, Dantooine, and Ukir. Without the Agri-Corps, agricultural production in the galaxy would have been substantially lessened, leading to a generally less food-secure Republic. Jedi washouts assigned to the Agri-Corps were trained to focus on the living Force, and their Force abilities were put to work cultivating crops and helping them grow. While service in the Agri-Corps was far less glamorous than service as a Jedi Knight, members of the Agri-Corps saved many lives on a regular basis, as they played a major role in preventing or alleviating famines. Next up is the Medical Corps, which was one of the smallest of the service corps, as the healing arts were well known to your average Jedi Knight. Nonetheless, there were some Jedi washouts who were assigned to serve as full-time Jedi healers. Members of the Med Corps, as you would expect, focused on preserving the living Force in patients and using it to heal wounds and save lives. The skills of members of the Med Corps rivaled those of the galaxy's finest surgeons, as the Force granted healers incredible intuition when it came to deciding how to heal a patient, and a broad range of options in how to heal them. The Med Corps often sent healers out across the Republic to help poorer worlds deal with plagues and the aftermaths of violent incidents. Additionally, they maintain the Halls of Healing within the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, one of the finest medical facilities in the entire galaxy, with the assistance of the Jedi Healers, the aforementioned group of Jedi Consulars who devoted their lives to similar work. Full Jedi Healers often acted as the leaders of the Med-Corps, with Med-Corps personnel acting as nurses and the healers taking the role of doctors. During the Clone Wars, most members of the Med-Corps were sent off to the front lines to serve as battlefield medics, and they saved the lives of many clones over the course of the conflict. Another small service corps was the Educational Corps, in which Jedi washouts became librarians, archivists, and teachers. Members of the Edu-Corps helped maintain the Jedi archives on Coruscant, but they were also sent out across the galaxy to gather material for the archives or to serve as teachers on the Republic's poorer worlds. In the Edu-Corps, members focused on using the Force to connect with other beings for easier instruction. They also worked with some of the Jedi Consular sects, helping to maintain and expand the archives alongside the Jedi Archivists, and sometimes participating in academic work alongside the Jedi researchers. The last service corps was the Exploration Corps. The Explore Corps was composed of archaeologists, researchers, xenoanthropologists, and astrocartographers, and their job was to seek out hyperspace routes, planets, and civilizations unknown to the Republic. They used the Force to find artifacts, dig sites, and above all, plot safe routes through hyperspace. Of all the service corps, the Explore Corps had the most difficult and dangerous job, but also the most exciting one. The Explore Corps' hyperspace scouts were invaluable not just to the Jedi Order, but to the Republic as well. Finding new routes through hyperspace involved making blind jumps and hoping for the best, or at least for something other than a fatal collision with a mass shadow. Through the Force, members of the Explore Corps were able to find useful routes with far greater ease than regular scouts, which provided innumerable opportunities for the Order and the Republic. The Explore Corps often performed surveys on planets they discovered, either assessing existing civilizations or analyzing evidence of ancient ones. From their original homeworld of Ossus, the Jedi Knights spread far across the galaxy, fighting for peace and justice across the Republic. Over the course of their history, the Jedi established enclaves and satellite academies on many worlds, as we've discussed throughout this series. Some of these settlements were small and quickly faded into obscurity, but on other planets, especially on Force nexuses strongly attuned to the light side, the Jedi established more permanent operations, and the echoes of their presence were often felt on such worlds for centuries after the Jedi left. Today, we'll be looking at some of the most important Jedi planets, apart from Ossus, which we covered in depth earlier in this series. First things first, let's talk about Coruscant. After the destruction of Ossus during the Great Sith War, Coruscant became the new homeworld of the Jedi Order, but despite this distinction, the history of Jedi settlements in Galactic City was actually pretty short. Though the Jedi Order had been allied with the Galactic Republic since 25,000 BBY, for millennia it avoided establishing academies, temples, or any sort of permanent Jedi facility on the galactic capital, as the Order was, at that time, cautious about entangling itself in Senate politics. It was only in 5000 BBY, 20,000 years into the Jedi Republic alliance, that the first Jedi Enclave on Coruscant was established. This happened right after the end of the Great Hyperspace War, in which the Jedi Order defended Coruscant and the core worlds of the Republic from the forces of the Sith Empire. In gratitude for the Jedi's vital role in saving Coruscant from the Sith, the Republic gave the Jedi Order ownership of a piece of land in Galactic City as a gift. This land grant included the Sacred Spire, the peak of a mountain that was among the tallest on the planet. This mountain had been a place of worship for the ancient Coruscanti, and the Jedi were already familiar with it as it contained a powerful Force nexus that Jedi occasionally made pilgrimages to visit. The Republic hoped that by granting the Jedi ownership of the Sacred Spire, they would construct a fortress around it, like the fortresses they had built on Ossus, which would dissuade future attacks on Coruscant. But the Jedi initially had no intentions of building such a fortress. They took possession of the Sacred Spire, but all they did at first was build some small shrines around its peak, which were home to a small number of Jedi Knights. This was the Jedi Order's only permanent presence on Coruscant for the next 1,000 years, until Ossus was destroyed in 3996 BBY. After the devastation of Ossus, the Jedi Order was rendered homeless. All the lore and artifacts that could be salvaged from Ossus were moved to Exis Station, which became the Order's temporary base of operations. But a new, more permanent Jedi capital was needed. Coruscant soon became one of the top contenders for this new capital's location. After the destruction of Ossus, 4 of the Order's greatest surviving Jedi Masters, 2 Sage Masters and 2 Warrior Masters, traveled to the Sacred Spire on Coruscant, where they decided to build a new Jedi temple at the site, a fortress along the lines of what the Republic had originally wanted the Jedi to build on Coruscant. The new Jedi temple, when finished, completely enclosed the Sacred Spire, and after its construction was completed, the Jedi Order formally selected it as its new headquarters, relocating most of what had been salvaged from Ossus to its archives. The Jedi Councils took up residence in the new temple, as did a great many Jedi. Over the course of the next few thousand years, the Jedi Temple steadily expanded. It was left in ruins and abandoned by the Jedi for a short while after the sacking of Coruscant during the Great Galactic War, but it was eventually reclaimed by the Jedi and rebuilt, and its steady expansion continued. Over the course of 3,000 years, the Jedi Temple was continuously rebuilt and expanded, becoming larger and larger as the Jedi Order became more centralized and Coruscant-centric. The last major bout of construction took place in the aftermath of the 7th Battle of Ruusan, 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, and it saw the temple transformed into the towering monolith we know from the films. Even by the time of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Temple Precinct, which contained the temple and its surrounding support facilities, was the Jedi Order's only territory on Coruscant. Coruscant was less a Jedi planet and more a planet with some Jedi land on it. Thus, we're not going to be providing an overview of Coruscant in its entirety here. However, we will be providing a thorough overview of the Jedi Temple. Originally, it started as a collection of small shrines and libraries, but as the temple grew, new towers and outbuildings sprang up around the original complex. Eventually, all of these buildings were hidden under a massive armored sheath, becoming the temple ziggurat, with only 5 spires rising up through this great metal shell. The temple was a kilometer in height, and it was home to 10,000 Jedi by the start of the Clone Wars. It was surrounded by the Temple Court, a sprawling courtyard dotted with the statues of ancient Jedi heroes that separated the temple from the surrounding city blocks. The temple ziggurat was built in the shape of a trapezoidal prism with 4 tall piers on each side, flat on top and surrounded by a low-lying outer wall at its base. The main entrance to the temple was located at the base of the eastern pier at the end of the processional way, a large memorial road that ended in a ceremonial staircase. At the top of this staircase were statues of the 4 masters that founded the temple, whose images were also emblazoned onto the enormous stone pylons that made up the temple's formal entrance. Beyond these pylons was the Jedi Temple's enormous entrance hall, one of several massive pillared halls located at the base of the temple ziggurat. Other, smaller entrances were located at the bases of the other piers. The western and southern entrances were general access, while the northern entrance was specifically for non-Jedi visitors. The interior of the temple ziggurat was incredibly complex, a dense collection of structures of various ages. The outer sections of the ziggurat were frequented the most, while the innermost parts of the temple were largely abandoned, visited only by those Jedi Masters who knew the temple well enough to navigate its innermost reaches. The whole structure was encased in an armored durasteel sheath, which was nearly impenetrable. We're going to go through the highlights of this section in no particular order, since there isn't really another way to do it. Beyond the main entrance hall was the Great Hall of the Jedi Temple, an enormous 4-story hall, the largest in the entire structure. This hall directly led to the base of the Sacred Spire, the heart of the Jedi Temple. Also adjacent to the main entrance hall were the endpoints of the meditative walkway, a grand, ornate hallway that ran a circuit around the base of the Jedi Temple. Originally, this was a courtyard located directly behind the ancient exterior walls of the temple, but later renovations transformed it into an enclosed space that completely surrounded the base of the ziggurat. The interior walls of the meditative walkway were lined with a grand arcade of stained glass windows and bronzium statues, which commemorated the Great Hyperspace War and the Jedi heroes who fought in it. This was a replica of a similar arcade that had been built on Ossus, and the meditative walkway even incorporated a few windows and floor tiles that had been salvaged from one of the Ossus temples. The walkway also featured stone tablets carved with the Jedi Code, as well as small rotunda chapels in its corners. The chapel in the southeastern corner was one of the oldest parts of the temple, originally an outbuilding that was later swallowed by the main temple as part of its expansion. This chapel was used for meditation by newly selected Padawans. Above the base of the temple, several sections of old walls dating from just before the start of the new Sith Wars were preserved, hidden under the armored sheath of the modern temple. Even older sections were preserved in some of the piers. A large stone tower in the eastern pier was almost 3,500 years old, dating back to the aftermath of the Galactic Wars, and it served as a museum of temple history by the time of the Clone Wars. Located just behind this structure was a large cluster of older stone towers built in different monumental styles, all of them ancient. One of these structures was the reading room of the original Jedi Library. The library had long ago been moved elsewhere, but the reading room was preserved due to the quality of its architecture and converted into a formal banquet hall. Other ancient structures in this part of the temple had been similarly repurposed, with one large building being converted into the office of the Jedi Exploration Corps. Most of the other Jedi Service Corps had their offices in the southwestern part of the temple, which also contained lightsaber training facilities and lightsaber repair workshops. A lightsaber crafting facility, as well as another lightsaber practice gallery, was located in the northeast corner of the temple, near the top of the ziggurat. The northwestern quarter of the Jedi Temple was largely taken up by the Jedi Academy, an enormous subcomplex within the temple where initiates and Padawans were housed and trained. The northeastern quarter contained the public center, one of the few parts of the Jedi Temple that was open to the public, as well as a large number of workshops, storerooms, and maintenance facilities. The private chambers of the Jedi living in the temple were scattered all over, as were numerous other support facilities and halls. In the southeast quadrant, on the inner side of the stained glass arcade along the meditative walkway, was the Room of 1,000 Fountains, an enormous meditative garden that contained a wide variety of plant life, as well as waterfalls, streams, and fountains. The ceiling projected the image of a forest planet's daytime sky, completing the room's peaceful atmosphere. A similar system was used in the ceiling of the lake level, a 5-story section that housed an artificial lake complete with beaches, another popular meditation spot. Scattered throughout the temple's southeastern quadrant were the Sith containment cells, an ancient dungeon meant to hold captured Sith and Sith-spawn creatures. The Agricor Research Laboratory, which contained biodomes for alien flora, the Halls of Healing, a medical center ran by the Medical Corps, several training facilities, including a high-tech holographic training area used to simulate combat scenarios, and the Jedi Archives and Library. At the heart of the temple ziggurat, many of the ancient shrines on the sacred spire still remained, albeit enclosed within a large hall surrounding the base of the temple's central tower. The black rock peak of the sacred spire remained largely intact, dotted with meditation balconies and the entrances to internal cave chapels. It was surrounded by a ring of newer shrines, one of which contained a floor mosaic salvaged from Ossus. Deep within the sacred spire was the Chamber of Conclave, where representatives from the scattered Jedi enclaves met once annually to deliver reports to the Jedi High Council. The top of the temple ziggurat was flat and featured large plazas, which were sometimes used for initiate training or as landing sites for visiting delegates' ships. Several contemplation gardens were located on the roof, as were skylights that allowed sunlight into the temple, communications infrastructure, and the garages and hangars that housed the Jedi Order's arsenal of spacecraft and speeders. There were also Jedi Starfighter hangars built into the bases of 4 council towers, each with extendable landing platforms. The top of the Jedi Temple was crowned by 5 towers. The outer 4 towers housed the Jedi Councils, and they all had identical designs. Each tower had a hangar section at its base, above which were large data centers and communications control rooms. Each of the council towers doubled as a massive communications transceiver, as the bulk of each tower was dominated by extremely powerful communications infrastructure meant to allow the Jedi Councils to keep contact with Jedi on missions all across the galaxy. The antennae at the tops of each tower were some of the most sophisticated pieces of communications technology in the galaxy, located far above the tangled electromagnetic fields of Galactic City for optimal transmission quality. Some of these antennae tapped into the cosmic energy fields of the galaxy itself to broadcast and receive transmissions. The upper reaches of each tower contained a large planning room consisting of a circular walkway around a large hollow projected galaxy map suspended above the tower's hollow lower interior. 3 sets of doors connected this level to an exterior balcony that ran around the tower, which featured 3 contemplation stations, larger balconies suspended high above Galactic City. Directly above the planning room, on the highest level of each tower, was the council chamber, an open, circular room with broad windows and seating for the masters of the Jedi Councils. Each of the 4 towers was home to a different Jedi Council. The Jedi High Council met in the northeastern tower, while the Council of First Knowledge met in the southeastern tower, the Reassignment Council met in the southwestern tower, and the Council of Reconciliation met in the northwestern tower. The 5th and largest tower of the Jedi Temple was the Temple Spire, a mostly ceremonial structure built on top of the peak of the Sacred Spire. The domed base of the Temple Spire contained this ancient mountain's peak, which was ringed by 2 balconies. The lower balcony was lined with hollow projectors that generated images showcasing the history of the Jedi Order, and it was where the youngest Jedi initiates were brought to start their education. The upper balcony was for meditation on the Force Nexus contained within the mountain. Above the peak, the temple spire mostly consisted of a hollow space ringed with balconies, within which floated statues of the most revered Jedi, suspended on repulsor lift pads. There were also 3 final chambers at the top of the temple spire. The lowest was a set of meditation chambers where Padawans spent the night before their knighting in meditation on the Force. Above this was the Hall of Knighthood, a larger chamber with 4 fin-like wings that extended out from the main structure of the temple. This was where the Jedi High Council typically carried out knighting ceremonies, and it was also where knights were raised to the title of Jedi Master. Above the Hall of Knighthood was the Pinnacle Room, a windowed room reminiscent of the council chambers in the other towers. Access to the Pinnacle Room was restricted, for this chamber housed the most ancient Jedi texts in a carefully controlled environment. This was the Jedi Order's most sacred site, the highest point of the Jedi Temple. After Ossus and Coruscant, by far the most important Jedi planet was Ilum, a frigid world in the unknown regions. Accessible only by a secret Jedi hyperlane from Metalos in the core worlds, Ilum was remote, obscure, and closely guarded by the Jedi. The planet was inhospitable, and even at the Jedi Order's height, only a few Jedi, if any, were permanently stationed on the planet. Most of Ilum's surface was covered in ice, home only to a few hardy plants and animals. It was a small, lonely world far from civilization, orbiting a blue dwarf star, and from orbit it appeared entirely insignificant. But those who ventured into the vast caverns below the planet's surface could immediately see that Ilum was anything but insignificant, as the planet's caverns were packed full of Force-attuned crystals. These crystals were what made Ilum one of the most important Jedi worlds. The Jedi discovered Ilum all the way back in 22,800 BBY during the earliest millennia of the Order's history. That year, a Jedi scout tracked the planet's strong Force signature through hyperspace, blazing a route from Metalos out into the unknown regions. She relayed her discovery back to the Jedi High Council, which dispatched survey teams from Ossus to scout out the planet. One of these teams accidentally discovered the Crystal Caves while seeking refuge from local predators, and following this discovery, the Jedi Order claimed Ilum for its own. Initially, the Jedi Order kept Ilum a closely guarded secret. They didn't report its discovery to the Senate, erased all mention of it from official databases and records, and kept the route to the planet secret too. Over the millennia, the word of Ilum's existence leaked out, but the Jedi were nonetheless able to prevent outsiders from finding the planet for most of their history. Once Ilum was secure, the Jedi built several temples, shrines, and enclaves across the planet, which became popular pilgrimage sites for wandering Jedi Knights. Originally, Ilum was just another pilgrimage site for the Jedi, as it wasn't until 13,000 years after Ilum's discovery that the Jedi began to build the first lightsabers. Even then, the crystals found on Ilum were only some of the many varieties of lightsaber crystals the Jedi used to craft their weapon, and they weren't even the most popular kinds. However, Adagan crystals, which were found on Ossus and the other worlds of the Adega system, were originally the most popular as they were highly attuned to the Force, to the point where Jedi could sense their locations, and they also produced higher quality blades than most other crystals. However, Adagan crystals were rare, even on Ossus, and as a result, Ilum crystals steadily became a more popular choice. Ilum crystals produced lightsaber blades of a similarly high quality to Adagan crystals, but they had less prominent Force signatures, which meant that Jedi couldn't sense their locations as they could with Adagan crystals. Ilum crystals also only ever produced blue, green, or very rarely purple blades, in contrast to Adagan crystals, which could produce blades of a much larger variety of colors. Despite their inferior quality, however, Ilum crystals became increasingly popular due to the sheer volume of them present in the crystal caves of Ilum. They were far more common than Adagan crystals, and consequently, they began to become the most popular kind of lightsaber crystal in the years leading up to the Great Sith War. The Great Sith War sealed the deal, as the destruction of the Adega system meant that Adagan crystals became extremely rare. Over the course of the next few thousand years, Ilum became the primary source of lightsaber crystals for Jedi. Initiates and Padawans looking to build their first lightsabers traveled to Ilum itself as part of the Gathering, a ritual in which young Jedi would venture into the crystal caves to locate and bond with a crystal, which they would use to build their first lightsabers. The Jedi also harvested larger batches of Ilum crystals for storage in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, so that older Jedi whose lightsabers had been destroyed or wanted to build a new lightsaber for whatever reason didn't have to go all the way back to Ilum to start over. There were many sets of crystal caves on Ilum, most with their own shrines, Jedi enclaves, or temples, most of which had few, if any, permanent residents. The largest and most significant Jedi site on Ilum, however, was the Ilum Temple, which was where the Gathering was held. The temple was built over the largest set of crystal caves, which ran for tens of thousands of kilometers deep under one of Ilum's mountain ranges. The cave system was volcanic in nature and had walls of black rock, which were dotted with blue, green, and purple Ilum crystals. The full extent of the crystal caves was never mapped, and the sheer volume of Ilum crystals created a powerful Force nexus within the cave. This nexus caused hallucinations and disorientation in those who entered the caves, and as a result, some of the Jedi who ventured into these caves never came out, ending up lost forever deep in the labyrinth. Some Jedi who entered the crystal caves were unable to see any other crystals apart from one that called to them, while others experienced more vivid hallucinations. When Anakin Skywalker traveled to the caves to build his first lightsaber, he came face to face with a vision of Darth Maul, which he had to battle and defeat to complete his lightsaber. The Ilum Temple was located at the mouth of the crystal caves, and it was a fairly simple structure, if ornate and ancient. The temple was carved into the stone of the mountainside, its interior lit by sunlight from large transparisteel windows built into the structure's western face. The external entrance to the temple led into the main chamber, a large hall adorned with the statues of Jedi. Circular windows in the upper wall of this hall allowed sunlight into the room, which was refracted through a large crystal suspended from the ceiling. This crystal was used to melt an ice sheet on the eastern wall, allowing passage into the crystal caves beyond. The Ilum Temple also contained numerous storerooms, workshops, and meditation chambers that branched off from the main structure, though by the time of the Clone Wars, they were rarely visited. Another prominent Jedi world was Tython, the original birthplace of the Jedi Order. Tython was a beautiful, verdant world in the deep core, with a strong connection to the Force. And in the pre-Republic era, it was home to the Jedi Order, the predecessors of the Jedi. The Jedi Order was destroyed in a schism between the adherents of the light side and the dark side toward the end of the pre-Republic era, and the Jedi Order was formed by the victorious Lightsiders, who abandoned Tython for Ossus due to the devastation the Force Wars had inflicted upon the planet. Tython was abandoned for more than 20,000 years, but it was rediscovered by the Jedi around the time of the Galactic Wars. The Jedi relocated to Tython after the Jedi Temple on Coruscant was destroyed in the sacking of Coruscant, and the planet once more became their headquarters for a short while during this period. We won't go into depth about the Jedi Temples of Tython in this video, as we've discussed them extensively in the past, and they were long abandoned ruins in the time of the Jedi. These ruins were just one kind of evidence of the ancient wars that had been fought on Tython. The planet was also haunted by Sith-spawned monsters and the mutated descendants of ancient Rakatan cast-offs. Indeed, while Tython was immensely strong in the Force, it was not strictly a bastion of the light side. The dark side was strong on parts of this planet, lurking in the depths of its caves or the hearts of its forests. But the light side was strong on Tython as well, and many Jedi found peace in its beautiful plains, forests, and mountains, despite the turmoil that gripped the outside galaxy. During their brief return to Tython, the Jedi established a few of their own facilities on the planet, most notably a new Jedi Temple. This temple was much smaller and simpler than the one on Coruscant, and it was built of local timber and stone atop the ruins of an older Jedi structure. Nonetheless, this temple was sufficient to serve as the Jedi Order's main base of operations and the new home of the Jedi Councils. Drawing on the designs of Bomar monasteries, the new temple consisted of 3 rounded cupolas built around a larger central one surrounded by outbuildings and support facilities. The temple itself contained quarters for the Jedi who lived there, the archives and Jedi library, the meeting chambers of Jedi councils, map rooms, lecture halls, storerooms, workshops, memorials, meditation chambers, and much more, while other facilities, such as the Master's Retreat, were located in the region around the temple proper. The Jedi Order's facilities on Tython were simple, but elegant and functional, the latter of which was especially important in the Galactic Wars. It provided a suitable base of operations for the Jedi Order until the original Jedi Temple could be rebuilt, following which the Jedi relocated their headquarters back to Coruscant. It's unknown if the Jedi Temple on Tython was abandoned following this relocation, or if it remained active as a satellite academy for some time afterwards. Either way, it was ultimately destroyed during the new Sith Wars, when the Sith Lord Belia Darzu transformed Tython into a barren, ashen wasteland saturated with the dark side, erasing all trace of the Jedi and Jedi before them from the planet. During an earlier stage of the old Sith Wars, Dantooine served a similar role for the Jedi Order, acting as a hidden redoubt and auxiliary headquarters during the Mandalorian Wars and Jedi Civil War. Dantooine was a remote and largely unspoiled planet in the far outer rim, home to only a few scattered settlers and farmers. Its surface was dominated by grasslands, and while it wasn't the most potent Force nexus, the light side had a presence there, allowing Jedi to easily find peace on Dantooine's surface. There were even crystal caves on Dantooine, though they were small and prowled by dangerous Kinrath spiders. Like Coruscant, Dantooine wasn't a Jedi-exclusive world, as will be the case for most of the other planets we'll be discussing going forward. However, it was home to a Jedi Enclave, the most important Jedi Enclave at that. As we discussed earlier in this series, Jedi Enclaves were satellite facilities governed by their own small Jedi councils, which answered to the Jedi High Council on Coruscant but largely operated independently. Jedi operating out of the Enclaves typically answered to the Enclave Council first, rather than to the Jedi High Council, and as such, the Enclaves were more like the headquarters of separate branches of the Jedi Order than simple outposts. The Jedi Enclave on Dantooine was the most important one, however. It was one of the largest and best maintained, and was highly important to the Order as a whole. Most of the Masters that sat on its ruling council sat on the High Council as well. At the time of the Enclave's destruction, the Masters of its Jedi Councils were Jar Lestin, who oversaw the instruction of apprentices and Padawans, Master Dorak, the chronicler of the Enclave and overseer of its archives, Vanda Tokare, a member of the High Council, and Vruk Lamar, who oversaw relations with the people of Dantooine. The Dantooine Jedi Enclave was a somewhat small and low-lying structure built according to the architectural norms of Dantooine settlers. The main facility consisted of 3 large rounded stone structures with fin-like protrusions, most of them open to the sky. The largest of these was a hangar where Jedi ships could land and be serviced. Several shops, including an Aratech mercantile, were also located in the hangar complex. The hangar was connected to the main building of the Enclave by a winding passage which led roughly north. This main building was circular, dominated by a central garden area open to the sky, which contained trees and small pools. From the central hub of the main building, 2 long wings stretched off north and east. The east wing contained a passage that led to the Enclave's main entrance, while the north wing contained the Enclave's dormitories. To the west of the Enclave's hub was the smallest of the 3 main buildings, which contained the circular chamber where the Enclave Council met. Attached to this chamber was a set of training rooms. The main doors of the Enclave led out to a small courtyard which lay along the banks of a river. A bridge led over this river into the Dantooine outback, which was sparsely populated and full of wild Kath hounds. On the north end of the courtyard, at the tip of the north wing of the Enclave's central building, was a set of doors that led down into the Enclave's sublevel, an underground section that was unconnected to the above-ground parts of the Enclave. The sub-level was massive, and it contained storerooms, workshops, additional dormitories, lecture halls, the droid maintenance bay, the Enclave's main computer room, a set of meditation gardens, and the Enclave archives. The existence of the Dantooine Enclave was kept a closely guarded secret by the Jedi Order during the Old Sith Wars, meant for use as a last redoubt should the Jedi Temple on Coruscant come under threat. Consequently, it was run by some of the Order's most powerful Jedi Masters, and while new Jedi were sometimes trained at the Enclave, only the best and brightest recruits, those all but guaranteed to become Jedi Knights, were trained on Dantooine to keep the secret from leaking out. As a result, the Jedi on Dantooine represented the best of the Order, and Jedi who had been trained at the Enclave were held in particular regard. During the Mandalorian Wars and Jedi Civil War, the Jedi Enclave became an increasingly important redoubt for the Jedi. During the latter war, Dantooine became the Jedi Order's de facto headquarters as the Sith were encroaching ever closer to the core worlds. This increased importance led to tragedy as Dantooine was attacked by Darth Malak toward the end of the Jedi Civil War, and the Jedi Enclave was destroyed. Over the next 500 years, its ruins were thoroughly plundered by salvagers, and though the last Masters of the High Council briefly attempted to rebuild the Enclave during the Dark Wars, the project ended after they were killed by Darth Traya, and the Dantooine Jedi Enclave was ultimately abandoned for good. The Jedi Agricultural Corps later established a small facility on Dantooine, but it was separate from the old Enclave and much smaller. Most of the other known Jedi facilities scattered across the galaxy were small and mostly similar to Dantooine, so from this point forward we're going to pick up the pace a little and start discussing the remaining Jedi worlds and categories, beginning with the other Jedi Enclaves. These were all mostly the same as the Enclave on Dantooine, small redoubts meant to act as remote strongholds, academies for gifted students, and defensive bastions on the frontiers of the Republic. The oldest known Jedi Enclaves were located on Hashimut and Falang Minor, which were once fortress worlds along the Republic's borders with the Tyon Cluster, watchposts from which the Jedi kept an eye on the Taiwanese pirate states with which the Republic fought its first war. These enclaves were likely abandoned after the Taiwanese War of 24,000 BBY, but the Jedi Order established many other enclaves on the Republic's borders over the years, such as the Taris Jedi Tower, which was established as an outpost on the borders of Mandalorian space. There were also enclaves on worlds closer to the Republic's heart. Corellia, for instance, was home to the Green Jedi Enclave. Other Jedi Enclaves were located on Genarius, Bespin, Umbria, Aloxel, Mustafar, Kolarin, and Dorin. The Dorin Enclave was jointly run by the Jedi Order and the Barando Sages. Other Jedi planets were home to Jedi Praexiums or academies, which were satellite facilities devoted primarily to the training of Jedi. Praexiums were small facilities that typically trained only a few Jedi at a time, usually under the tutelage of only one Jedi Master. Such outposts existed on Arcania, Masposhane, Truine, Boltim, and Teia 4. Jedi Praexiums largely became a thing of the past after the Great Sith War, however, and most satellite training facilities in later eras were Jedi Academies, which were larger and better staffed. The most important Jedi Satellite Academy was the Kamparus Jedi Training Center, which was overseen by Master Yaddle and was where the legendary Master Joruus C'baoth was trained. Other major academies were the Kulu Memorial Center on Alpha Redes and the Almas Academy on Almas. Other academies were located on Harath, Bafash, Telos 4, Obra Sky, Shidumad, and Socorro. Some of these academies were known for promoting heterodox teachings. The Masters of the Almas Academy, for instance, strayed from Jedi doctrine in quite a few ways, while the entire membership of the Bafash Jedi Training Center fell to the dark side during the Clone Wars. There were also Jedi chapter houses, which served as small outposts and way stations rather than academies in their own right. There were Jedi chapter houses on Tanab, Aileen Minor, Rinal, and Marfa. Lastly, there were a few planets with Jedi temples or libraries of their own. These were usually pilgrimage sites rather than dwellings, but some had permanent staff and doubled as chapter houses or facilities of another sort. The Dawn Temple on Spintir and the Halls of Knowledge on Fatim were examples of this. The former was a prison for Jedi who had fallen to the dark side, while the latter was a Jedi library and storehouse that had once housed the largest collection of Force-imbued artifacts in the galaxy. Examples of more ordinary Jedi temples included the Temple of Edith on Deveron, the Kamas Jedi Temple on Kamas, the Temple Akablas on Oratera, and the Lost City of the Jedi, a secret outpost the Jedi had built on Yavin 4 after the end of the Great Sith War.